Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Corporate Training Summit. My name is Mark Murray, and I'm the Associate Publisher of the Worcester Business Journal. The Worcester Business Journal is pleased to be the media sponsor and excited to partner with the Training Associates to produce this event. This morning, we'll provide what I hope will be a compelling forum, assembling some of the best thought leaders in the training industry to share insights, direction, and trends related to corporate training and development in our constantly changing 21st century business environment. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, the Training Associates, along with our supporting sponsors, AXO, CompTIA, Curry Printing, Incentive Advisors, and Knowledge Advisors, we're able to produce this Corporate Training Summit. Thank you to all our sponsors. We're grateful and most appreciative of your commitment and generosity to this event. Before we begin, just a reminder that at the conclusion of our program this morning, we have a special door prize, a Bose docking station, generously donated by our presenting sponsor, the Training Associates. To enter, all you need to do is place your business card in a bag at the center of each table. At the end of the last session, we'll collect all the cards from each of the tables and draw a winner from the group. However, there's one caveat. You must be present to win. So stick around, I'm sure you will. Now to get on with our program, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Vic Melfa, the CEO and co-founder of Training Associates. Vic oversees the long-term strategic growth of the Training Associates. For over 40 years, he has consulted for, founded, and managed emerging companies at the forefront of the computer development, distribution, and training industries. Previously, Vic was founder and CEO of Vitronix, a $75 million value-added distributor and training organization, the largest in the Northeast, which he sold to a New York Stock Exchange computer firm. Vic was founder of CompTIA and the IT Training Association, which is now CompTIA's Technology Learning Group. Vic was an adjunct professor at Boston College and Boston University, where he taught technical and management courses and developed their first entrepreneurial studies course. Vic earned his bachelor's degree in physics from Holy Cross, a master's degree in physics from Columbia University, and an MBA degree from Northeastern University. He has received numerous awards, including CompTIA's first Lifetime Achievement Award, and has been recognized for his industry white paper that he authored. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Vic Melfa.
I appreciate all that. Thank you. And welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Happy to see you. And look forward to a morning that will help all of us hopefully increase your company's productivity, your profits, and make you each heroes in your company as you understand what we have to offer. Just a couple of words on us before we move ahead. The Training Associates was founded about 17 years ago. We've been blessed in our growth. We're now the largest provider of trainer professionals worldwide. We have over 2,000 on agreement. We teach over 15,000 courses. We specialize in IT and business professional skills. We have a unique business model and real big economies of scale, such that we can provide the most expert training professionals at the lowest possible price. That's a mouthful. It's hard to believe, but it's true. In front of you, you have packets that detail our services, our expertise, what we have to offer, why companies work with us of all sizes. And we also have the industry acclaimed white paper on that details the examination of staff trainers versus contract trainers. It's the only paper and detailed explanation study of that. available, and you and your company, people in your company will really like that, and we're available to go into any kind of detail on that if you want. So without further ado, we do have industry experts here today that we're happy to present to you. You can learn a lot from, and we look forward to reading you all and understanding your needs and your businesses and your problems, and to hopefully serving you in the future. Again, thank you. God bless.
Shulman, who's our Director of Business Development. I'm happy to present Richard.
Thanks, Vic. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to see so many people. We're pleased to welcome you all here this morning to this Corporate Training Summit. I'm sure this is the first time you've all attended the Corporate Training Summit, as this is the first. As Vic and Mark mentioned, the program assembled should be informative, thought-provoking, and really get your juices flowing. At the end of the summit, we hope that your knowledge is expanded, your connections are enhanced, and your understanding of the complexities of successful engagements are improved. During the breaks, we encourage you all to visit with the sponsors who have been mentioned. Go to their booths, to their tables, garner additional information about resources available. Find out what's really going on in the business. The sponsors are looking forward to meeting with everyone, and I really mean everyone. At this time, I have a question to ask both the TTA people who are here, as well as our guests, and that is, if you have with you any kind of electronic device, would you please raise your right hand? So I say it's fairly unanimous. With your right hand, please take your device, and with your left hand, please put it on mute. I'll wait. Additionally, for your information, the program is going to be videotaped, is being videotaped, and we will provide the link for the videotape so that you don't have to take excessive notes, but you can take notes as you please. You should be getting the link within about a week. Without any further ado, our first speaker for the conference is Professor William Vanderbilt. William is an in-demand and accomplished educator, facilitator, and writer. William has a wide and extensive portfolio of business and training accomplishments. William speaks from a viewpoint that encompasses the entire business spectrum, from the corporate side to the provider side. It's a thrill for me to introduce William because I count him as one of my friends. So please, William, be our first speaker.
Thanks, Richard. You come to as a friend as well. So welcome, everybody. It's good to have you here. I'm honored to have the opportunity. I am here to talk a little bit about how learning must be sold, and it reminds me a little of my son. I try to get him to do things in school, and at the end of the day, he says, yeah, it's important, but I really need to sell him on the context of school, and boy, I tell you, sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't know if you have teenagers, but... So when you talk about training, one of the things that people talk about is they say that it's often very important. People say that, well, training is necessary, but the actions don't always support that. It's difficult to get people to commit to training. Anybody experience some of that? No, I've seen it. It can range from all kinds of things, right? Sometimes you have students in your classes distracted by SMS and email. And thank you, by the way, for paying attention. I've seen many folks that are distracted by things that are always going on in the classes. Just this past weekend, I was teaching the class, and I had the manager who had paid good money for all these people here say, you know, we have 4 hours allocated to this day of training, but the big boss has come in and said, we need to cut it in half. Happens all the time, right? I'm sure any of you that have experienced what I'm talking about can empathize with that very thing. Executives don't always make training mandatory. Even though they say it's important, they don't step up and say it has to be done. And when you have partners that you're dealing with, partners they say may need some training, whether it's technical or sales or whatever, but those partners often don't step up and do it unless they have to do it to maintain their status. So the reality is people talk about these. It's a classic important but not urgent situation. Do you know what I mean when I say important but not urgent? Right? It's not something that's pressing that I have to do right now, but I acknowledge it's important, and we'll get to it when we get time. Of course, when is there ever time? So it really is kind of that same thing that we see in the boardroom, all the way down to the individual workers, all throughout. People talk about it, but it never makes the priorities. So it gets even worse, though, when you start to look at what kind of control we have in the learning field. And when you start to examine it, really the learning organization just has a few people that report to it. Right? There are trainers, there are instructional designers, there are the administrators and registrars, but at the end of the day, who do we really have control over? Not many. We really are not in a position of mandating that things happen. We're not in a place of saying that training has to be done. And so we're stuck with just the ability to influence. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is all about influence. Since we don't have control, how do we influence? The learning organization, nonetheless, isn't let off the hook. Anybody feel like you can just get away without producing results in the training field? Certainly not. I mean, the bottom line is that executives expect us to produce some results, even though we don't have the ability to require it, even though we don't have the control, somehow we have all the accountability. So there's that balance between how do we drive results without necessarily having that control. And at the end of all of this, we need to keep in mind, people are the most valuable asset that an organization has. If I look at the balance sheet of any company, it's based on 1900s kind of thinking, right? The assets of an organization are the facilities, the plants, the manufacturing equipment, and in reality, in today's world, what is most valuable in driving value in a company? It's the skills, the experience, the knowledge, the capabilities of those people. And so the question is, how do we really maximize that? And of course, some executives realize that, and that's why they put the accountability on us in that training field to say, we've got to get the most out of that asset. So we need to start to think and act more like general managers. And I'm sure some of these messages you've heard in other places, this is not necessarily new thinking, new ideas, but we do definitely need to think as a general manager, not as a training manager, not as a trainer or an instructional designer. I challenge everybody here to think as a general manager, somebody that has complete responsibility for the organization. And that means you need to understand the vision of the organization. Where is it going? What's happening? Where is the future of this business? If you think about growth strategies, is my company growing by taking market share? Is my company growing by expanding the number of markets that we're reaching? Is my company growing by upselling and cross-selling and selling into new customers? Or are we taking the existing customers and selling new products into them? What am I doing as an organization, and where's my business going? We need to be an expert in people. We need to be able to listen and empathize with those people and understand what's driving them, put ourselves in their shoes. We need to cast a vision in all directions, right? So the folks above us, the folks that we report to, actually see a vision from us. The folks below us see a vision from us, and out throughout. We need to be strong leaders, and that means that we act with confidence and yet humility. Leaders definitely lead through humility, but with confidence. And we need to focus on financials. And when I say financials, I don't just mean training financials. You know what I mean by training financials? Like butts in seats and cost of training and all of that stuff. You know who cares about that stuff? Nobody. Sorry, maybe you do, but the reality is the rest of the organization doesn't care. So, what is it then that we're trying to do? What is this business all about? Fundamentally, it's about business results. Right? we are in the business of making money for our organizations. Vic talked about it, right? That we are very much business professionals, and we need to be very focused. Whatever your job, we need to be very focused on business results. Why? Because you won't get a paycheck otherwise, right? At the end of the day, business results are what produce paychecks for everybody in our organization. So what do I mean by business results? I mean, what is the business? What is the organization seeking? What are the ultimate goals of the organization? How is success measured by the organization? What kind of metrics are they using? What kind of dashboards are they using? And in what time frames are they looking to produce results? These are the kinds of things that I mean when I talk about business results. So the question is, how do you produce business results? Well, first of all, you set targets. So you've got to understand, what are those targets that the rest of the organizations are looking for? We need to set targets around those things as it relates to training, and then work towards those targets. We've got to have a goal in mind. Anybody that's ever used a GPS knows you got to put in the endpoint, right? And so setting targets is a clearly important point in being able to get to the end result and say, here's where we're going to achieve. But ultimately, the way you produce business results is by driving investments and behaviors in training. What do you suppose I mean by that? Investments and behaviors in training. Getting people to latch into what behaviors really drive the impact that we can get. We need them to make investments not just in money, but in time, in their own mindset, in making training a high priority within the organization. It's not just about making the money available, it's about mind share and winning those priorities over. And so our business is to drive those investments, to drive that behavior, because it is when people make those investments in their passion, in their behaviors, in their focus, in that mindset, that's when we start to produce those results. And that's where setting targets can really fall into place. Well, how then do we drive investments and behaviors? Well, there's a few ways. One is through incentives, programs, and resources. I call this the carrot and the stick mentality. Y'all know carrots and sticks, right? I dangle a carrot out in front of somebody and I say, if you get focus on training, if you do these certain things, then you get this reward. And certainly carrots and sticks are successful. They work with my son. They have to work with everybody. The bottom line is that carrots and sticks keep people motivated. Walls of fame and shame, or whatever you want to use, however you want to do it. Carrots and sticks affect behavior. They affect investments. The problem with them is that they're short term. If the carrot's not there anymore, what happens to the behavior? If the stick's not there anymore, what happens to the behavior? It falls away. So how else can you manage it? One is through plans and processes. Having a vision of what does the future look like and what is our steps towards success. How do you get there, end customer? How do you get there in terms of results? And then building a process towards that and executing that plan. But fundamentally, investments and behaviors are driven by trust, relationship, and attitude. People will invest in anything, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's resource, when there's trust, when there's a belief that I can get that kind of return that I'm expecting. In fact, that trust, relationship, and attitude comes when you have things like consistency and fairness. I mean, think of it your own self. Would you put your own hard-earned savings in an account that is just going to be wildly unpredictable in terms of the returns? Of course not. You want consistency, you want fairness, you want to know that if I put my investment in this thing, that there's going to be a fair return on that, and it's going to be predictable and consistent and fair. A lot of people have taken their money out of the market recently because it's too volatile, it's not consistent, and they see it as unfair. So they've lost trust, and that trust has meant that people don't make investments. It's no different in our world. And they want alignment and review. It means that we need to go back and regularly say, are we on track? Are we accomplishing what we said we would? That builds trust, and those things drive investments and behaviors, and that ultimately produces results. So that's pretty theoretical. I think it says a lot, but it's pretty theoretical. How do we start to get into this? I guess the question is really, at the end of the day, what is it that our clients are buying from us? What is a business unit buying? What is an organization buying from a learning organization? What do you think? What are they really buying? Classes? What's your reaction? Just so you know, what do you think? I'll speak at once.
Performance improvement.
Okay, improvements in their areas of matter, right? They want to improve performance in those areas.
Time.
Time? Tell me more.
They're saving time.
They want to reduce time, right? The time that they invest in doing things.
Better results.
Better results. Define as many different things, right? Reduced inventory, increased sales, and reduced expenses, faster turnover, better employee satisfaction, lots of different things, right? So what is it then that we do? What do we deliver to our clients? I'm afraid that often we talk about it in terms of training, right? And the reality is we need to be talking about it in terms that relate to them. And again, I know that we've heard these things. This is not rocket science. This is not new information, but we're guilty of it, folks. We often talk about how many classes, how many heads, what's this, what's that, right? And the reality is we need to deliver value to our clients, and value is defined in their metrics, not in ours. So we need to be thinking about what it is we sell, because here's the thing I want to emphasize, folks. We are in the business of selling. You have to be in the business of selling. Everything you know about trading, you've got to know, but you're in the business of selling. And selling through influence. And how do you sell through influence? By understanding what your clients want, what they need. So when you want to know then what matters to your clients, I made a little checklist of things that folks tend to be interested in when they're looking to purchase training, when they're looking to invest in training and make those behavioral changes. First of all, they want to be dealt with in a consistent fashion. And let's face it, if you buy anything, you want consistency. You don't want to go to a website to buy something where they're changing it every month in terms of how you pay for stuff or how you interact with them. If you buy from a retail entity, you want to know where stuff is. Gosh, nothing frustrates me more than going to the grocery store and I can't find where it is because they rearranged the whole store. The reality is when you sell something, you've got to be consistent in how you take it to market. And so I would challenge you to think about, do I consistently talk to people about trading in the same ways? Do I sell them in the same ways? Is it the same stuff? It needs to evolve over time, but if it's changing constantly, that's frustrating to anybody. The investment needs to be understood and managed. I need to know, what are you asking me to invest in, and how am I going to be able to manage that? It needs to be aligned with my goals. Am I going to get out of it what I thought I was going to get? They need to be able to get those returns that we talked about, things like satisfaction of customers, partners, employees, the revenue and profit or cash impacts. By the way, don't underestimate the value of cash. Right? We often think of training in terms of profit and how much profit we can return. I'd ask you this, do you know how much cash your training can produce or take away? The training that you provide can have a dramatic impact on cash. And you may think that doesn't matter. Take a look around, folks. There's a credit crunch in the world. Cash is king. Profit matters, and so does cash. So ask yourself, how does my ask of what I'm taking to market, how does that affect the cash of the organization? You might even do a little grid that says, what are the cash outflows and cash inflows that this business unit, this organization can expect from this training? The learning organization fundamentally has to be easy to do business with. E-T-D-B-W. Easy to do business with. The bottom line is you have to make it easy. It's much easier to do, right? So the bottom line is you have to be easy to do business with. Nobody wants to buy from somebody that's difficult. So ask yourself, is it easy to get training? Is it easy to buy training? I made a little list. I find top 10 lists often work. They work for David Letterman. Why shouldn't they work for me, right? So a list of what is it that I should be thinking about if I'm in the business of educating folks, if I'm in the business of making those assets better, if I'm helping my organization with their improvements in performance, what are they asking? What's going on in their brain? And in my experience, these are 10 questions that the folks that are out there to purchase or consume training are thinking about. Maybe they ask you, maybe they don't. But in my experience, these are the questions they need answered before they're able to make a decision. And here's the thing, if you don't answer it for them, Think they're going to get an answer? Yep, that's about right. They will get an answer. It may not be the answer you would have given. It may be something very different. So my recommendation is be proactive. Don't wait for them to ask the question. Be prepared. In fact, I have found it sometimes successful to take this kind of a list, and if I'm going to make a presentation of some sort, whether it's a PowerPoint or whether it's going to just be a conversation, I proactively address it. Hey, I'm thinking that most of the people that I talk to about the kind of services I deliver want to know how much need really exists. And so what I have found is, most of the people that I talk to want to know, how's my life going to be different as a result of what this education is all about. So let me tell you, here's what I see being the change in how things are done in your organization. And what alternatives will, there's a couple different ways that we could do this. And here's my recommendation, and yet there's a plan B and a plan C. My point is, if you're proactive about these 10 questions, you're in a much better position to get them past all their obstacles before they actually stand back and say, well, I can't do this, and not even explain why they can't do it. Once you've given them these things, then of course you can say, is there anything else standing in the way? No? Okay. Certainly a way to gain commitment, certainly a way to influence. Okay, to move on. I see people writing feverish. Okay, I'm going to move on. So ultimately, we're about change. Let's face it. Does anybody work for an organization that has a budget that's smaller this year than last year? No? Yeah, okay, some do. But generally, it's expected that we're going to produce more. That's the world we live in. And how do you produce more? You've got to change, right? So we are in the business of selling change. That's a way to think about this. So what commitments to change are you trying to bring about externally? Change in behavior, change in the way things are done, change in the way people think about their job, the way that they make investments, the time that they invest in certain things. But we're also about change inside of our own organization. You see, as a learning leader, you have a responsibility to sell both outside your organization and inside your organization. You have to bring about change inside of your organization. I've seen far too many people from the learning industry that think, I don't have to do anything different. I know my education. I've been to school. I know what it means to teach and design. And the reality is that they need to understand they too need to change. They need to change by being more invested in the business. They need to change in many different ways. And so we as learning leaders are always on the business of selling and influencing outside and inside of our organization. We have to be focused on bringing about change in every part of the organization if we're going to succeed. That's back to that confidence and humility that I talked about earlier. That's part of how we demonstrate that. So if we're going to bring about change, if we're going to affect organizations, if we're going to really produce some results, one of the things is we just need to start thinking about what it is that causes people to tick. What are the things that really get them motivated? And I would suggest that there are different kinds of people, and what I'm going to share here is kind of a broad statement, but it may be similar in your organization, it may be different, fine, just consider the differences. But there's issues that people think about, there's time frames that they think in, and then there are constraints, things that they say, I just can't do this because of the following. So let's talk about some of those things. First, let's start with executives. Generally speaking, what are some of the issues that executives worry about? What keeps them up at night? Not related to training, but just overall. What are the executives' concerns?
Growth and profitability.
Profitability, growth. What else?
Competition.
Competition. Shareholders, they're my bosses, right? What are they saying?
Government regulations.
Government regulations, those might even be some constraints.
Reputation.
Yeah. Reputation, branding.
Uncertainty.
Oh, uncertainty or risk, right? How do I eliminate risk? Good. Absolutely, all of those things. I think these are very much in line with some of what I heard. Employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction, maybe I'd add in there. These are the things that matter to executives. So when you're talking to an executive, the point is, do you talk about these things? You have to, because this is what's going to motivate them, right? When you sit down with an executive, if you're not talking about these things, you know what's happening? We're heading for lunch. And what time frame do executives think about?
This quarter.
This quarter? I heard 5 years. I mean, let's face it, not all executives are created the same, right? But at the end of the day, tends to be executives think about longer term. They think about annual plans, quarterly numbers, or long-term planning, right? Strategic thinking. And so, to some degree, they're interested in the quarter because how much is it going to affect my cash or my share price or things this quarter. But they're also interested in that long term. What's this going to do for my long-term vision, my reputation, my competitive advantageness, all of these things. And so when you talk about training to these folks, you better be talking about what's the long-term direction. That's going to be different with different people, right? But the point is, talk in terms that matter to them. What constrains an executive? Why would an executive say, no, can't do this? Cost. Lots of different issues, right? But fundamentally, it's things like the board of directors, the law, unless you work in a place like Enron or something, I guess. There's things like morals and ethics that drive them. There's access to capital. Let's face it, a big executive doesn't have a budget per se. It's how much money can I raise? And is this a good return on investment compared to my other investment opportunities? So those are the kinds of constraints. When you talk to executives, you're thinking about those constraints, those issues, those timeframes. How's it different for middle managers? What are their issues?
Meeting plan.
What was it?
Meeting plan.
Okay. Meeting plan. Can I get to, somebody's giving me a budget, I better hit the budget.
Their staff, managing people.
Salaries, associates, how many people are in my organization? Are they satisfied? My product lines, my individual responsibilities, right? So it's things like demand gen and growth around the areas that matter to me, territory management perhaps, individual departmental performance, turnover of employees, because man, that's frustrating when I get people that are gone from the organization. It's operational efficiencies. I gotta be more efficient with my resources, and politics. Oh wait, hey, that's a middle management nightmare, right? How's this gonna affect politics? And how am I gonna forecast or report on my business better? What kind of time frame are these people thinking about? Sooner. Maybe monthly, maybe quarterly kind of things. They're not as long as the executive, but they're willing to give a week or a month or a quarter at a time generally. These are the kind of time frames they think about. So if I'm talking about how's this training going to affect you next year, you think the middle manager cares? Nope. I might not be in this job next year. What's it going to do for me this month, this quarter? How's it going to affect my business, right? And what are they constrained about? Budget, right? They have a budget. They have to live within that budget. They can't just go raise more capital. They can't go to the bank and say, let's get more money. They can't go take out and sell stock somewhere in the company. They have to worry about what their budget is. And by the way, it also matters, whatever matters to my boss is what matters to me. And therefore, if it's important to my boss, it's important to me. It's again about influencing this executive so that we can influence these middle managers. How about the issues of the operators and the line workers? These are people that day to day have a job. They don't worry so much about the success of the organization. They're interested in just roadblocks, right? What's stopping me from doing my job? What are the systems and processes I got to use? How do I get further? How am I paid? That's all I care about. And what kind of time frame do they worry about? Right this minute. Is it going to make it easier for me right now? I don't care about the future at all. What happens right now? As far as their constraints, time. It's going to take me more time. Is it easy for me to do something? Here's my point in all of this. Look, this grid is not so foreign. I don't think there's anything in here that makes you go, oh, this is really new information. No, it's not. But it's just the mentality we need to have depending on who we're talking to, right? If you're going to sell training, if you're going to influence people to really take things seriously and prioritize education, talk in their terms. Talk in ways that matter to them. What are their issues and how does this affect their issues? Talk in their time frames. Consider their constraints. Don't ask your middle manager to go raise money because the middle manager has a budget. That's that. So understand who you're talking to and what their issues, time frames, and constraints are. So my question is, can you articulate the value story and can you do it well? Can you positively impact the issues that affect executives? And if so, can you spell it out? Most of us say, yeah, I can do it. And then when I say, okay, do it, try it. Write it down. Why else should you write it down? Because then it helps to clarify that for other people too. Then there's a consistent stay-on message. What I find is if you don't write it down, you think you know it, you really don't. Moreover, everybody thinks they know it, and nobody's really aligned in how they say it. So make sure you have a clear and articulate message to your executives about why the learning organization, why learning can positively affect the issues of executives, and how it can positively affect the issues of middle managers and line workers. And if you need a different row in the grid, go for it. Look, it's just a tool. Use it any way you want. If you need a bunch of different rows, add them. Go for it. Just think about who are the people you're talking to and clearly document that value proposition. And then I'd ask you, do the rest of the people in your organization have that same message? Because remember I said consistency is a key to building trust and driving investment. And if you say one thing and somebody over here says something else and somebody over here says something else, that's not a consistent message. And the reality is you need to be very clear. For executives, this is our message. For middle managers, this is our message. For line workers, this is our message. And can they say it if they're standing in that elevator? And I'm not talking about a 200-floor building. Can they say it in a 30-second elevator ride? Make sure that that's all very, very clear to them. So, learning organizations then must learn to sell through influence. That's really the bottom line. It's the main challenge that we have. We have to convince our stakeholders that they should disproportionately invest in education and what we have for them, and that means that we need to compete for their mind share. When you think about who is your competition, you have competition, folks. That competition is what else is taking time, money, and thoughts out of what you are trying to get them to do. You got to keep them focused on what matters, and you want to win a disproportionate share of that mind share. That's your job. Selling to a place that they say, I'm giving more to this education group than really maybe I should. That's what you're all about. That's what influence is all about. It's the foundation of success for the learning organization, and you got to influence all the different stakeholders in the way they need to do it, but keep in mind, they're going to do what they do for their reasons, not yours. And so when you talk in language, when you talk about issues, all these things, you got to do it for their issues and make sure it's speaking their language, right? So you might think of this as a process, and I think this is no genius idea. There's nothing in here that's going to seem so foreign to you, but it's really a sales process that moves up a mountain. You can see here's a little mountain over here. I think that's Mount Eiger. Anybody know of Mount Eiger? It's this mountain in Switzerland that they say is just it's got one side that's easy to climb, the other side is a nightmare to climb, like you actually climb up halfway and then you got to hang there overnight and climb up the rest of the way while you sleep at the middle of the night. Yeah, that's not happening for me. Not a chance. I mean, it's a brutal climb. The reason that I raise this is, let's say you have the ability to climb Mount Eiger. You're a training professional. You know what's going on. You can make performance improvements in your organization. But the reality is your job is not to drag people up the north side of Mount Eiger, is it? It's to figure out what's the right path for them and take them down the path that's most appropriate for them, to follow that path. You're the guide. You're not the climber. So you got to figure out what matters to them. So what does this process look like? How do you influence people to say training really matters? Well, it's just like climbing a mountain. You get to the bottom, with the pre-approach. And what do I mean by that? I mean, first figure out, who are my stakeholders? Who are they? Who are the priority ones? Have I created a little grid to even think about who's everybody that is going to be an impact in this learning decision? And what do they think about my training? And what kind of coverage do I have with them? I mean, it's simple sales kinds of things, but we're not salespeople most often. We don't act like it, certainly, but what is that pre-approach? Who are all the organizational players I need to affect in and out of my organization? Then there's an approach and opening, back to that simple elevator pitch, that value statement. Can I articulate it clearly? Can everybody in my organization do that? Do I have it down? What's that key message that's going to resonate with the issues and timeframes and constraints of each of the people that I'm talking to? Got to get that wired. And once I have that approach and opening down, then I can begin a process of investigation and value awareness. What's that mean? Questions. And once you ask a question, what's the next thing you do? Wait. You know what wait means? Why am I talking? 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them in the right proportion. Ask some questions. What's driving your business? What are the issues that matter to you? What's your dashboard? If your budget is increasing, how are you going to get there? Once you have these kinds of investigative conversations with those key stakeholders, then you can get to the place of presenting propositions. The challenge is we're trainers and we love to be the stage. We love to be on the stage talking about it, right? We jump straight to that presentation mode all the time. We need to be much better investigators. We need to be very, very good at understanding what matters to our folks and not jumping to the conclusion that we know. So once you have thoroughly done that investigation and value awareness, then you move to the presenting propositions. And gaining commitment is critical, right? Things like overcoming objections. I know many of us teach sales, we know these things. We need to be practicing it ourselves. How do you interact with people? How do you know the different buy signals? How do you do trial closes? Those kinds of things are ways of gaining commitment. There's a little story I like to tell. 4 frogs are sitting on a log. One of them decides to jump off. How many are still on the log? 4. Just because you decided to doesn't mean you actually did. Right? What are the steps? What's it going to take, stakeholder, for you to get to this next step? What is the action plan that we're going to use to get there? You've got to get to that level of commitment. Otherwise, you know what's going to happen? Exactly what happened to me last week. Well, if I cut it down, looks like I did a pretty bad job then, right? I mean, the bottom line is you got to get that commitment, and then you got to implement and manage. And training is not about just getting the commitment, but ongoing. Implement and manage that process all the way through. It's massively about project management and implementing ongoing. So this is the very simple steps. I don't think there's anything genius about this. It's common sales, but we need to be good at it. We need to practice it. We need to do it. And frankly, I think most of us don't. That's my opinion. So that's all I have. I think I'm on time. Yes, we're early. I'm early. That was at 8:45, so I got 30 questions. Yeah? Any questions or? Yes, sir.
You've talked about change, and you've talked about working with the goals and issues for each level of management. One of the things that many organizations are finding, for a variety of reasons, is that certainty is no longer, and that you're having to build your organization on the notion of perpetual change and with that perpetual training. Could you talk about how you structure I guess an education plan for the executives and for middle management in particular to say this is the new norm, and then what you would include in that message?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm not sure that I have all the answers for you by any means. I'm sure many people in this room may have some ideas, and I would encourage people to speak up. My immediate reaction is I would certainly be talking about my organization as the place to go to be able to deal with that change. The reality is people will do the same things all the time unless they are taught to do something different. Nobody likes to change. We all like the same way of doing things, and the only way that executive is going to be able to deal with that change is if they truly empower and enable and leverage us within the training organization to be able to handle that change, to drive that change. We have to be the experts in change. So what are the specifics? Gosh, I don't know. I mean, we have to continue to roll with the punches ourselves. We need to be able to change our delivery methodologies and the content and the amount of time and all kinds of different things. We need to demonstrate what we talk about. I'm probably not giving the specifics you like, though, am I?
I guess, and so it would be those kinds of, traditionally, people take time out from their work, they go to training, they come back, you hope that their brains haven't emptied over the weekend and they can actually apply what they've learned. And going to a more ongoing training program, and again, awareness that that again, change is the new norm, both in terms of technology, but also business climate. Reading a piece about how a former Apple executive is taking over at JCPenney. So they're not only adopting broad social media programs, but they're also going to have to change the staff associates who are on the floor, who are going to have to be dealing with Groupon promotions and a variety of things that they may have never experienced before, and that 6 months from now it will be different again.
Yeah, I mean, obviously those kinds of changes are everywhere. I guess I see there being kind of two critical elements, and you mentioned one is, we've traditionally thought of training as events, and clearly it needs to be much more of a process, right? And so the question is, what do we do before, during, and after the event? And that's even more important now than ever. The other element I would emphasize is the focus on managerial support and training and input, involvement. I have really become a fan of saying, look, managers of these employees have to be in the classroom, and moreover, in addition to being in the classroom, they have to play an active role in the classroom. I'm a fan of having a special student book, but a manager's edition of the student book that says, here's the conversations you need to guide people through when they're all together. And then here are the conversations you need to be having afterwards. And every workshop must end with key action planning that says, what am I going to do specifically? And when am I going to sit down with my manager and review those tactical things that I said I'm going to do so that we're driving truly application? So I think there's critical elements of extending the learning past just the event, and critical elements of incorporating, supporting, and requiring managers of the students to be a part of the process, empowering and enabling them to say, this can't happen without your active involvement. And that's, again, influence, right? Now I got to go up a layer, and I got to get the executive to say, you have to be involved in educating the managers, and you need to be doing that. And that's a hard sell, but that's influence.
Our second speaker today is Susan Minaya. Susan has been in the learning and development arena for 25 years, and she's held positions both in business up to director of the Four-Guido University, of a brand that you would know from California. Susan is a skilled instructional designer, an accomplished business leader, and a guest lecturer in great demand. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you a leader in thought and a leader in process, another one who I like to call my friend, Susan Minaya.
Steve Richard is friends with the world. And that's what we love about him. Well, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. Well, so today, what I'm going to talk to you about is a roadmap for implementing a variable staffing model. So one of the things I want to ask is, how many here actually have a variable staffing model already? How many people are thinking about it? And how many people aren't really sure what a variable staffing model is? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Well, we're going to talk about that today, and hopefully you find a lot of value for the time that we're going to spend together. So let's start at the beginning then. So when we talk about a variable staffing model, let's get set on a common definition. And it's a very broad definition that I want to share with you. So variable staffing means a mix of full-time employees and contract labor resources. That's one definition of it. So you could have a role-based variable staffing, which means I hire instructional designers to come in, I hire trainers to come in, learning strategists on a project-by-project basis, or project managers to manage a learning project. Or it could be functionally based, and this is where it gets big, and you start talking about, I am actually going to outsource all of my instructional design work to contract labor, or a vendor that's going to provide that support for me, or all of my training organizations. So as we go forward, keep this very broad definition in mind as we talk about variable staffing. So my conversation with you today is going to be rather substantive, so I hope you've had enough coffee to get your head around some of the things we're going to talk about today, but I hope that you find it helpful. So, you know, as those of us who are learning leaders, we know these are very challenging times for us. We're faced with a lot of challenges, certainly because of economic times and the impact that has on our companies. Also, the business expansion into broader domestic markets. For some of us, our companies are expanding, and that's good news. Or we could be expanding globally. For others of us, we're downsizing our organization. Our budgets have been cut. Our company is shrinking in size potentially. And yet, the interesting thing about the learning and development arena, if you're in that space, you know one thing is for sure, that the demand doesn't change. There always seems to be tons of demand for the services that we provide, whether they're validated as William talked with us about today, like what kind of value does that bring to the organization, or is it just a nice to have? We do get a lot of demand increases. And then layer on top of that the fact that technology for us is moving at the speed of light. For those of us in the learning and development space, wow, how many people are truly in corporate training? Can I get a show of hands? So you know what I'm talking about, right? How do we integrate social media? How do we leverage mobile learning for our staff? These are very challenging questions that people are flocking to industry conferences to try to get their head around and be able to understand. And we also have those technologies that we've implemented, and we have so many different modalities that are available to us today. So, you know, I think it's fair to say that those of us, specifically in the learning profession, would call these very challenging times. And I love this quote here by Peter Drucker, you know, because he's really telling us that it isn't the turbulence for us that's really the danger to our longevity as learning and development organizations. What is really the danger and the challenge here is the solutions that we identify to meet those turbulent times and challenges. So for me as a learning executive, for 5 years running, I ran in a world that's fraught with dramatic change. I mean huge change initiatives, from being a major size, having to downsize, having to reduce my staff size, having to implement technology because we weren't a very sophisticated organization when I started. And so, you know, this was such an exhausting period of my career that it was, and exhausting because of the magnitude of change, but it was also an exhilarating time for me. Because I happen to be somebody who's okay with change and I like a challenge. And the opportunities that were presented because of the change were very exciting for me. And it allowed me to open up my mind and see creative ways to be able to address those challenges. So I think that many of you have those similar experiences. And probably the exhaustion side you really understand. So one thing I learned during that 5 years of tremendous change in my career was really that I needed to be proactive in the way that I was doing things. What William talked about today. I wanted to have the answers and have the solutions and the ideas and plans in place before my C-suite came down to talk to me about what I should be doing or how I needed to do that. I don't really like authority sometimes, and so for me, I prefer to be the person that decides which direction my ship is going. And the interesting thing about that is when you are proactive, you really do gain the credibility of executives and the business partners that you serve. So as an executive of a corporate university, actually a variable staffing was one of the solutions that I implemented to be able to solve some of my business challenges that I had. So today what I'm going to share with you are my personal experiences and things that I've learned that I think other people would like to know. I don't know if any of you go to the Chief Learning Officer Symposium that happens, they usually do East Coast and West Coast venues. And last year, David Vance from Caterpillar really put up a lot of, messaging and financial reasons why people need to look at variable staffing. But I think what came away for me with that was that there's a lot of people that don't really understand how do I determine or understand if that's actually the right model for me. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is how you can kind of get to that answer for yourself in your organization. Does that sound like something you want to know? Yeah? All right. So we all know the expression, know thyself, right? So for the next little segment phase, we're going to talk about, we're going to change that to say, know thy organization. So that's really key because you're going to have to really do a deep dive into your data within your organization and your organizational data to really get to the decision points that you need to understand if variable staffing is the right model for you. And then the other key thing I'd like to say is that you're also going to have to practice being impersonal. So I don't know about many of you, but data is great, but sometimes you don't like the answers that you see when the data comes back. So that's a little bit challenging for us. So I would challenge you to be impersonal about that. So let's roll up our sleeves and look at what are the key indicators and drivers for this. So the best plans are made, and we're all learning and development professionals. It begins with the end in mind, right? We do that with all of our learning interventions. We start with what are the core objectives of this course. So it's not a different scenario when we're looking at this. So we have to apply that same principle here. So the first question is, you need to understand what business are you in? And I don't know, most of you, I don't know how often you might actually ask yourself that question. But it's a good question to ask because sometimes you might not really understand the answer for yourself. You might find yourself doing tons of things where you go, what the heck am I doing this for? So it's very important to take time to reflect on them. And here, the way you really understand what business are we in, everything starts with strategy within a learning organization. Again, I go back to the comments that William made with you today. Strategy is important. Learning organizations need to make sure, because of their limited resources, and not only in talent, but also in dollars, you have to make sure that the things that you're doing and investing your time in ties back to strategy. Because it's easier to sell your solution sets to your business partners and your clients to be able to do that. But, the strategy is going to help you because it's going to help you understand, is variable staffing the right model actually, given our corporate strategy, given our divisional strategies, given our learning and development organizational strategies, is variable staffing the right solution for this? But not only that, is now the right time to implement, or is later the right time to implement? Do I want to do this in a big bang because I have to, because of budget pressures, or can I do it in phases over time? So I think that it's very important that you understand not only your own strategic plans, certainly those in your enterprise, which everything should flow from, and also your business plans as well, the people, the clients that you're supporting, your business clients. And another key focus should be identifying what services that you can provide. So what should you keep doing? What do you need to stop doing? And what do you need to be doing differently? I've been through this exercise, and it's hard, right? Because you'll find yourself in a group of people talking about this, and all of a sudden everything's important, and there's nothing in the stop doing category. All of a sudden you go, well, that was great, but we didn't stop anything. We're still doing everything we said we have to do. So you have to take that deep dive. So I think that the key question is here, because of where do we start, stop, or do differently. Learning and development, much like shared services organizations anywhere in corporate America today, are faced with the same challenges. HR in particular, I think there's some HR people here. You understand what that's like because now the way businesses are starting to change model-wise, the businesses can choose to do business with you or actually do business with someone else. And it's the same for learning and development. A last note here that strategy will help you to find is exactly where you need to be providing your services. So understanding, so what is our playing field? Do I have only internal clients, or am I also supporting external clients, right? Am I doing this on a global scale? Am I doing it in the US? Am I doing it for the entire enterprise? Or am I doing it for a P&L type of experience for a learning organization? Or am I just supporting the sales division? And that's okay. You still have to do this work to understand. So now that you have clarity about your strategy, the services and your geography, so you've handled kind of a good foundational piece of the puzzle. The next piece, as any good human performance technologist would ask you, is what business problem are you trying to solve? So for us in learning and development, my experience has been that our talent challenges typically cluster here in these three big buckets. We have cost challenges, we have capability challenges, we have scalability challenges. Do you think that about covers it? Do you think I'm missing something? It's kind of a good broad range. So the important thing here is that for some people it could be in one bucket, but in some, or it could be in a couple. For me, I was the big winner. I had issues in all three. So let's start at probably the most intense area that you have to look at, and certainly that's the cost area. And the reason why I say that is that you have to understand your operational costs. That means you have to do the math. You got to get out that calculator. You got to pull out your financial sheets, and you got to start digging. And you become friends with the finance department, who can tell you some of those the answers to those mystery questions, like what is our freight rate? What is our overhead costs, right? So this is a very important area. And one thing I do want to call out, I think Vic Melfa had mentioned today at the beginning his white paper. I'm not going to go into all the mathematical calculations for you today. Vic's white paper does an excellent job of helping you understand how to actually work the math to understand these. What I'm going to share with you today are the things that you should be looking at. Okay, so I would encourage you to get your hands on the white paper. So the first thing here that you want to take a look at is the total cost of your full-time employees. And so I'm talking about, certainly you have your salary rates for your employees, but there's also the fringe rate. And for many companies, it could be 36% or higher on top of your actual salary costs. And you know, if you have a big organization, that's a really big number when you add that on. It's huge. And then on top of that, you have to look at the overhead costs. How much is it costing me for desk space? How much do I have to pay the IT department to be able to support my technology needs? How much does it cost for you know, the equipment that I have? And then there's the big behemoth here, which we have, which is travel, right? So that's significant. And we know the cost of travel these days is not cheap. And so understanding what kind of costs are you budgeting for every year with your travel costs, because it can be significant. The other piece you want to take a look at is the essentially the daily or hourly rate for contractors. So, you know, once you do your math on the first piece, which is the total cost of your FTE, you could actually break that down into an hourly rate or a daily rate. Oftentimes with contract resources, rates could be daily or they could be hourly. And oftentimes trainers tend to do daily rates for delivery personnel, and instructional designers you'll often find are more hourly temp rates. But it can vary, so it's good to understand both of them. And when you're looking at this, you probably are going to take a look at what is it for onshore here in US-based contractors that are supporting our needs, and also look at what are the costs for offshore contractors. And there's some benefits for that, certainly. When you match those two up, you're going to see huge cost differences. But one thing that a lot of people miss is the hidden costs with that. So it may look cheaper, but at the end of the day, you're hiring actual resources or providing salary for people that are project managing the offshore vendors. So there's something to pay attention to. And then the other piece here, this is my favorite out of all of these things in cost, is the utilization rate. I put a lot of stock in utilization rate. And how many people here know what the utilization rate is for their employees? Yeah, a lot of people really don't understand that. And it's such a critical question, and you'll see in the white paper it talks about that too. This is kind of like, this is really a magic number that you need to understand. And so for me, you know, oftentimes you'll see utilization rates, just to define that for people, is talking about how much time does the employee spend that they're actually doing what I'm supposedly paying them to do, right? So if I'm an instructional designer, how much time am I actually in a given year, or whatever the time frame is you're looking at, actually doing all of the phases of ADDIE? I'm doing my analysis, my design, my development, implementation, and evaluation piece. For a delivery personnel, how much time is actually spent preparing for the class, platform time, delivering the training, and then after that, the post-course wrap-up time that they're doing. So, you know, unfortunately, the only way really to figure out utilization, you can swag it, but the real way to do that and get a right number is to actually keep time cards, you know? So, hey, we love time cards, right? Come on, tell me, you love them. Your people hate them, and you hate them too. You hate to do them, and probably if you're a leader, you don't do them. But your people might. And it's so important, though. It was eye-opening for me. When I first went into this organization as an executive, we did not have timesheets. And I said, we need timesheets because we got to see what people are doing. And nobody likes it, so that's what everybody's grumbling. But at the end of the day, it was phenomenal to to me the truths that come out of that number. So for example, many companies typically do like 60 to 70% is kind of an average. And honestly, it depends on what they're doing. So for everybody, it could be different. So I can't be prescriptive about this. Some companies, you know, 60% is good. Some for 70. Some people even do 80. For me personally, 80% is a little high, especially if you have full-time employees, because the problem is they need time for administration. You know, they have to have time for PTO. You know, they have to attend meetings, they have to do their time cards, and they have to do all of those other ancillary type things that full-time employees do. And you have to allocate time for that, otherwise you have employees with huge burnout. So an 80% is not my favorite number. I tend to use 70% is my ratio that I look for. And if anybody ever falls at 60% or below, and when I have a learning organization that I'm supporting, it's kind of a red flag to me to take a look and see what's going on with that employee, and maybe am I resourcing what they're doing. So that's something to call out. So it's a very, very powerful number. The other piece is understanding demand. And this is hugely challenging, and this can also be very frustrating. So you need to understand the demand, because you got to know how much time are people actually going to spend delivering training. How much time will somebody actually be developing this training course for someone? So you need to have a sense of that, and it's very important that you do. Because so if you don't have like demand, a lot of times I find clients are very challenged. They may not have formal plans laid out. Most of you find it's kind of challenging to get from your clients exactly what it is that they're going to be doing next year. But there's a way you can find that, because at the end of the day, everybody has to submit for their budget for the following year. In that budget, you will find clues to what things are going on in their organization and how you're going to be able to, and see what's coming down the pipe. You're implementing a new technology system through the enterprise. You know these things are going to impact you as a learning and development organization. So you can get to that number, and then what you have to do is understand, so how much time do I actually need someone to deliver these courses, or develop these courses, or manage the workload? So that's a lot of data points, and it's exhausting, but you know, most of you probably have staff and that's what they're for, so you can have them help you get that done, right? So my story here is that I primarily had challenges for me and my full-time costs with my employees. My combined operating budget, don't gasp, was $12 million. Seems high for probably some people. I don't know, if you're a large corporation, maybe not. And I was 85 people strong. And while my operating budget really wasn't all that out of whack for, you know, percentage to over enterprise total budget, my ratios were all that bad. It was just way too many people to be supporting a 6,500 you know, employee population for a regional company. So when I started there, you know, what I found out is that we were staffed for what was perceived demand. So this is once you accept the job, right? Then you start going, uh-oh, look what we've got. The other thing was we didn't do demand planning at all. So everything was about, you know, we think we're going to do this kind of stuff, or that's what we did last year. We never really looked at how employees were spending our time. So we had legions of instructors around, and quite frankly, I had no clue what anybody was really doing. So it was very discerning for me. So then my path to a variable staffing model for me was actually 3 years to full implementation, where I did all of it to set it up the way that I wanted it. So I think the messaging I want to say here is that, you know, with variable staffing, you don't have to do everything right away. You can migrate to this model over time. And for me, I couldn't go there right away because I didn't understand if it was the right model for me, because I didn't have these data points to understand the good, intelligent business decisions. Does that make sense? Is this working for you? Am I giving you what you need? Okay, so the next thing I want to share with you is about capability. So the thing about capability, we're talking about skills of employees, the technology that you have, and also understanding what are your core competencies for your staff. So it depends on where you are in your organization, but you need to understand all of these things. So when we first look at, let's talk about when you're looking at employee and project analysis pieces, these are very critical. And this is data, fortunately for you, that you probably have right at your fingertips. So this isn't quite as tough as maybe some of the cost things. So for annual performance reviews, so you all have them. And here I think what you're looking for is consistent non-performers. And I would suggest to you that you're going to probably find a lot of those people sitting in the mid-range rating of performance within your organization. And so be cautious about that. They're not going to be, because most of you know with your bell curve, you have very few people that are sitting on the end that says poor performer. Usually those people don't stay around. But I would challenge you to dig a little bit deeper into your mid-range ratings with people, because oftentimes they sit there. Because my experience has been organizations are not good at paying for performance. It's very challenging to give someone a difficult performance review. So you need to pay attention in those particular areas and ask your delivery managers and your instructional design managers more about their staff and their real performance. You know, so look at that number and talk to your leadership team about their people. It's very important. The other piece is, again, we talked about this utilization. So the thing with utilization and employee overall performance is that it's not uncommon to find mediocre to poor performers that have very high utilization rates. So don't be fooled that the number is like, wow, Bob's working and his utilization rate's like 80% or whatever. You probably want to look there, because oftentimes poor performers do have very high utilization rates. And you know, those people are dragging your organization down, right, from a productivity perspective, and oftentimes from a quality perspective. So those are things that you want to understand. Who's really good and strong on your bench? And so they should be a red flag for you. So the other piece is really, you know, the project component too. When you look at their project results, it may be taking them longer to complete projects than other projects. So these are just some of the deeper, kind of subtle things that you need to pay attention to. And if you dig into them, this guy, sort of a medium performer, has really high utilization rates. Now let me go look at their project data and see what kind of feedback we're getting from the client on them. And you know, don't be surprised to see that you're going to see things that are like quality control issues and things like that, right? Have to go back, didn't really hit the mark, we kept having to go through the same type of thing. Important to pay attention to that. The other piece is cost and time to upskill. So what you need to do here is look at what skills do you need, as well as what do you have. So if you're looking to implement, say, something like a virtual learning platform for your staff, it can take up to a month to get them certified in that capability. And you know, if you haven't implemented that and are thinking about it, you know, it's a different, there's nuanced differences in how you design for that, and also being effective at delivery in that modality. So you have to understand that it takes a month to get there, but then it could take months afterwards, depending on the opportunity they get to use it to build proficiency. So here's something to understand when you're implementing mobile learning. Do you have instructional designers that understand how to develop for mobile learning? Do you, you know, and a lot of times that's just a push out, right? Or it could be where it's intervention-wise. It depends on how that's done. So you need to take a look and understand how much investment do I have to make in time and cost to get my employees where I need them to be. So it really depends on the opportunity that they have to use the skill could make that number higher or larger. The other thing is geographic and subject matter expertise and needs. So I don't know about you, but I've had instructors that I don't, this will sound facetious maybe, but you know, they're like one-trick ponies, right? They do one trick, and the problem is that they only do it a couple of times a year. And you know, so when you have situations like that, and they only do it a few times, you want to start looking a little bit at what are they doing? And some questions you should be asking here is, if you're considering variable staffing, is what they're doing so specialized that really it's very difficult to bring someone in with that kind of expertise. And in those cases, maybe variable staffing is not the thing for you. But the other thing is, if it is something that could be translated, the million-dollar question for you is going to be, is your content in a sustainable fashion? That means, is it written, or is it sitting in the instructor's heads and they're the only ones that know how to do that? That is a huge problem, and we need to get that into a sustainable, repeatable state so that a contractor could come in, you could hand them the facilitator guide, they see the participant guide and all the ancillary materials for training, and they're able to actually learn how to do it. So it's just some very important things to consider there. The other piece is certainly on the geography. So where are people located? Is your company expanding? Are you contracting? Are you supporting clients around the globe? Are you supporting channel partners that need training support? So all of these areas you need to understand, where are you actually delivering training, and where are your trainers in relation to where you need to be training? We talked about travel, no big mystery there. We know that travel is a huge, huge chunk of often many of our budgets. And that's something that variable staffing can support for you by getting resources that are housed in the area where the training needs to take place. So this is especially true and beneficial if you're working on a global scale as well, because with global, not only do you have extreme distances, right, but you have cultural differences, the way people interpret or understand the training to be able to support. And you'll hear more about that kind of thing, training on the global workforce later this afternoon. So we talked earlier about defining our service offerings, and really this is part of rationalizing your content portfolio. I don't know if you've ever gone through this exercise, but it's a very valuable exercise. Understanding what content do you have, what state is that content in, is it something that a vendor can come in and work with you and be able to pick up that content? Very, very important for the vendor to also be effectively supporting you. So the biggest caution I have for you here is really to be impersonal and realistic about the data that you're looking at here, these data points. Number one, because there's a ton of pride wrapped around projects and people's work products, if you will, and there's a lot of emotion wrapped around performance reviews. So this is where it can get a little bit sensitive when you're starting to dig deeper and uncover. My business challenge with capability was really in 3 areas. I had it in technology, I had it in geography, and I had it in people. So, you know, again, I was the trifecta winner in this department. So too many people I had that didn't have the right skills for where we were moving with our modalities. I had just implemented the virtual learning platform, Classroom, that we were starting to implement, and no one really had experience in that. So that was one of the pieces there. And then in addition to that, I had also implemented a learning content management system, and we were moving to a single source publishing capability, and which is a very different paradigm. If you know anything about that, I think there might have been someone actually from Outstart that was here today that could share more about that single source publishing component. It's very strategic and it's very valuable, but it's also a very different paradigm for designing training. So what happened was is that I needed people to work on the strategic work of designing our master curriculum using that platform and the single source content development approach. And what I did is I used variable staffing to support the maintenance of my contract, new things that were coming up that were unplanned for. And so I had instructional designers take on more of that labor, so my full-time staff, which had begun shrinking because of my budget cut reductions, were able to focus on the strategic work. So that's some things to think about as well. Additionally, we had we also had I wanted to share with you about a platform of a technology platform that we implemented, and I didn't really have resources to be able to support all the places that we have to go. So I used variable staffing in that case as well for training delivery, which was very valuable for me because I had sustainable content, I was able to bring contract instructors on board to be able to help us do that deployment. So basically when you look at it, you keep your internal people focused on the strategic component, or if you're outsourcing completely a particular function, then they're going to be your strategic players and they need to understand that as well. So I think in this area in particular, thinking about content sustainability is very, very important. The next thing we're going to talk about here is scalability. So it's a business problem that many people are facing. How many people have seen their business expand actually to different geographies and locations? Yeah. You know, even though we're having tough economic times, I run into a lot of people that have that challenge right now. I've been to like 2 major conferences here recently, and that's a common situation. How many people are struggling with downsizing of their organization or their geography? Yeah, there's a few. It's hard. You know, that's really hard stuff. So I think it sounds simple enough, I think, is really understanding your playing field and the geography that you're supporting in your clients here when we talk about scalability. So it sounds simple enough. Oh no, I only have 5 minutes, Richard. So the biggest challenge here is in the demand planning area. We talked about that earlier, right? For demand planning, get your strategies, but if you don't have strategies, go and get their business operating plans, take a look at their budgets, and as William said, go talk to them about what's keeping them up at night and what are the things that they're working on in the future. So I think the key here is that there's, when you look at scalability, it comes back to that travel cost issue. This is a huge place where you could save tons of money just by having localized resources, which variable staffing can provide for you. So for companies that are downsizing, you know, variable staffing is a great way for you to be able to still meet your client demand. You may not have the resources you had, but their demand typically doesn't change, and they still need you to train, and this is a way that you can still deliver on demand for them as well. So technology is often a solution that we have for efficiency and being able to get broader geography reach, but with it comes challenges where our staff needs to get upskilled. Variable staffing is another great way to consider for you because you can bring on board contractors that actually know how to be effective in virtual delivery or know how to design for mobile learning. And that's where you bring people in like that as an interim measure while you are upskilling your staff at the same time. So variable doesn't mean people go away in your staff. It could just mean that you're helping support them through a transitionary period. So again, here we have to look at that historical data, look at your operation and geography, and really the biggest thing here is you got to get out the map. You got to look and see where people are versus where you're going, and understand how variable contractors would be able to help support you to reduce your overall costs. So for me, really, if you look at it, I have a very simple scorecard that I put together for you, and if you look at it and can answer yes to any of these questions, variable staffing is a viable approach for you and something that you should be considering. So the last thing I want to touch on before I go in my very brief 3 minutes, so I have to talk quickly, but it's very critical because I think these are must-haves for success, because really when you work with a vendor to provide variable staffing for you, this is a partnership and you should see it that way. It's not just putting bodies in jobs. You need to have that partnership so that they can be effective in supporting you. So the key things I want to talk about here are service level agreements. I put them at the bottom because they're foundational. Service level agreements are very critical for defining the relationship. What's the scope, what's the cost, what's the skill sets I need, how long do I need them for, and what kind of performance level am I looking for? Are my delivery people going to have a 3.5 level 1? Are they going to have a 4.0? Are my instructional designers going to have skin in the game with results? How do you define success in their performance in that contract? The next thing that you need to consider is a defined workflow. So if you don't have this mapped out in your organization, you might want to consider that, because what it says is here's the different points in our process from beginning to end that we have, and people, the value of that is that everyone in the organization, in the learning organization, understands how they fit into this 1,000-foot view. And what's beneficial about that is as you work with vendors and people are popping in at different points, you're able to kind of pinpoint where you might have service breakdowns and challenges as you go along. And lastly is evaluation. So evaluation is critical because what good is a service level agreement if we don't ever go back and take a look at how are we performing against that agreement. So here you do define metrics. What are the key performance indicators? What are the levels of evaluation you want to be supporting? What kind of results are you looking for? And then the frequency with which you interact with the vendors. Some people do it annually with a scorecard, a performance scorecard. Some people do it quarterly. I would recommend frequency is better because you don't want to wait for a long time and have service challenges and the vendor doesn't get to hear that. So communication is so critical, which is why I have it wrapped around this entire triangle. You must have that two-way communication. And I would say as a company, working with a vendor, you need to also ask them how you're performing and give them an opportunity to share that with you because, you know, everybody has skin in the game for the success of the engagement with a variable staffing model. You'll do yourself a service and you'll allow the vendor to be other service partners for you if you take the time to talk more and really be clear about what your metrics and performance criteria are. So I kind of talked with you about these different pieces, and I think these slides will be available in the presentation part. But you know, they're so important, and I did talk about it. The service level defines the foundation and the agreement. The workflow helps people understand what am I doing, and it helps people who manage the work understand service breakdowns. And evaluation makes sure that we're all on the same page and the same track. So for those, my last comment is I don't know where you're at. I'll talk with you about this as we go out because Richard's about to come up. Huh? Yes, I have Q&A. And I can touch on this if you want. You can ask it in the question. But there's some components around navigating the political landscape with this. And the only thing I'd like to say to you is that you need to understand the organization. Typically, if you own the budget, you can pretty much make your decisions. But you should still socialize some of the things that you're doing. Sometimes your business partners care and sometimes they don't. And I'm happy to talk with you about it because I had some real challenges with this, but I was able to implement variable staffing with very challenging groups and claims organizations and things that thought no one from outside could do this by introducing it in bits and doses. So I'd be happy to share more of my story about that with you on the break. So I'll open it up for questions in a few minutes. What questions do you have? Because I'm sure you have some. Yes.
In April of this year, I became director of our learning shared services. We basically took 10 different training departments and we're all coming together. So I have people from all over the place, and where sustainable content really jumps out at me because I have people who have assets on their laptop in Calgary and in their head, and when they walk into the classroom, they're scratched out on the napkin that's in Calgary. So how did you start to wrestle that issue?
You know, I feel for you because this is so challenging, but I'm glad that you see the work you have ahead of you because when I started into this role, I started May 1st, and they said, guess what, we're rolling out a brand new contact center on July 4th. I'm like, or 5th. I'm like, are you kidding me? Great. I'm like, okay, well, where's the content? No. I went to the facilitators. It's in a outline format. I'm like, you're kidding me. And essentially what I did is I put people to work. Facilitators became instructional designers. I was like, you know, we have a mission critical role out here, opening up a 500-seat contact center, and we have content in the outline format, and I have to cross-skill other trainers from the organization that we just acquired. Nightmare situation. But I will tell you, they did it. They did it. Everybody became instructional designers. And they essentially, you know, because it was a strategic initiative for the company, I just moved resources onto that, and they had to put it together like pronto. The facilitators were really happy with me because they weren't used to doing that. But ultimately, they actually became great partners in what I like to call the three-legged stool for content design, where you have the instructor lens, you have the instructional designer lens, and you have the business lens of the scene. So you need to do that rapidly.
What we've done first is we've outlined the template for the perfect guide, perfect guide, presentation experience.
Perfect.
So, but when some of the facilitators are, they're nervous that if they take it from here into here, they're predicting where this could go. So that's the other part.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there I just talk about the value of what they're doing and to the organization as a whole. And I would say, going back to incentives, you find some carrot for them that makes it worth it to want to invest that into a really great job. Thank you for sharing that. That was great. Sure. What other questions do you have? Yes, in the back.
What's a burning platform?
What's a burning platform? I love this. A burning platform is you find basically the town crier. If we don't do this, this is the impact on the enterprise or the organization. There's a great site out there. It's like a change site, and it talks about that a burning platform is critical for any major change initiative, so that people understand why we need to do this. And when you're trying to influence the budget or things like that, I've used this very effectively. You know, and the site even says if you don't have a burning platform, make one up.
What's the site?
I make sure to Lynn's point again that everybody's talking about that same burning platform, same language, same issues, same recount.
What's the site?
But I'm going to get it for you. I'll look it up really quick. I don't have it. I wrote it down, and I will get it for you. It's an awesome site. It's really great. But it talks about how you implement that. My time is up, but I'm here for the whole time, so I'll be out on break. And if you'd like to come up and chat with me, I'd love to talk with you about it. Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to introduce our third speaker, who has had a long and distinguished career. Dr. Tom Coughlan has worked in higher education, as well as big and emerging businesses, and as well as an entrepreneur. He specialized in management, marketing, and organizational behavior with emphasis on technology, yielding high productivity and innovation. Though I can't say he's a long-standing friend, I certainly hope that we will become friends over time. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Coughlan. Good morning.
Morning.
we wait.
Yeah.
I realize I'm the third guy on the agenda, so good morning. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, by the way, I hate podiums. I'm one of those guys who've always sort of stood out and talked to people. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was generations in the workplace. Now, if we look at generations and the definition of what a generation is, there's a lot of common definitions. And we can probably come up with several of our own. This is one that I took from the Journal of Healthcare Management. What seems to be common around a lot of the functional definitions that people use in HR or use in business tends to be that we're looking for people who are born in relatively the same time period and have a shared set of experiences. Now this becomes important as we talk later, but the shared set of experience part. But what is probably the largest group that you would define as a generation that are working in business today? What is the largest percentage of the working population? How would they define them as a generation? Baby boomers, okay. Who's the second largest? Gen X. Those two groups make up probably, well, they're certainly north of half of the population, and depending upon whose numbers you grab, we're looking at about 60% of the working population today are either baby boomers or Gen Xers. But there are several other generations that we're dealing with. There are still the GIs out there. Now, these are the guys who went off to World War II. They probably lived through, as young children, part of the Depression, and they, as young adults, were there fighting for this country. After them came the silent generation. And these are the poor people that are sort of sandwiched between what Tom Brokaw is going to call the greatest generation, and those people who are the much heralded boomers. These are people who are now probably in their 70s, or maybe even early 80s. Then we've got our boomers, who are going from, say, their early 60s until their very late 40s. Then we've got the Gen Xers, who are in their, you know, let's say, like middle 40s to even maybe around 30. Then we've got the millennials, or the Gen Ys, who were born somewhere around, well, they're probably in the age of somewhere around 21 to 25 at this point, depending upon the early ones, and the youngest ones are 10 or 12 years old. So as we look at these different groups, there are a few things that become very important, especially as these groups move through time. Now, this is a chart that I pulled from the Journal of People and Strategy. Now, you'll notice the definitions here are slightly different. This is not physics, all right? The ball does not drop at 32 feet per second square every time, because we're dealing with people. So when you're dealing with people, your definitions may change a little bit, but the overall themes tend to stay the same. And if we look at this, you're going to notice that the boomers, we see here in the blue, okay, they're a huge part of our population today, and they're going to be a significant part of our population all the way until about 2040. Now, the youngest boomers today, under most definitions, are somewhere in their late 40s, and the oldest boomers are somewhere in their early 60s. And you're sitting there wondering to yourself, well, how is that possible? We all know we retire at 65, right? Maybe you're expecting to retire at 65? I was so glad that Susan brought up Peter Drucker. Okay, so Peter Drucker was the god of management, the most prolific management writer in the last century. Drucker, as of the 1980s, was suggesting, number one, that the boomers and the following generations would have no chance of retiring at 65. And a lot of that has to do with this idea of 65. Where did that come from? The idea of 65 came in the 30s when they were putting together Social Security. Life expectancy in the 30s was south of 60. So you were not expected to be alive to collect Social Security. That was the plan. Drucker in the 80s suggested that we will be working into our 80s. Now, before all of you start panicking and believing that you're going to be putting in 120-hour work weeks in your 80s, that's not what he suggested. What he suggested is, as we move forward, the definitions of work and full-time work will change. We will not, though, completely retire at the age of 65 and play nothing but golf for 40 years. What is likely to happen is our definitions of work will change, and our definitions of what's going to be needed for training and development of these people are going to change. They may only be working 20 or 30 hours a week. They may only be working 9 months a year, but they will still be working. And the funny thing is, the front end of this, the front end of the baby boomers, are already beginning to get into this area. So over the next decade, you're going to see this change and develop. So one of the things that we will see common in, and this is an impossible slide to read, I realize. But one of the things that is common among the definitions that we have when we take a look at the generations is people try to put a profile on the generation. A profile that should be consistent across a large group. So if we look at the GIs, again, these are the guys who were brought up in the era of being children in the Depression and coming of age during World War II. So these were defining moments in their lives and may have something that affected them for the rest of their lives, like the fact that they saved every paperclip that they're ever given. You know, the fact that they will reuse file folders 100 times until they're falling apart. They're also, their definition of where they sit in the organization is very traditional. There is a boss and there is a worker. There is a superior to your position. They are theoretically very patriotic, and they're brave, and they're willing to take on a lot of challenges. If we take a look at the silent generation, these are the guys who were probably children during World War II, and they were the Happy Days generation. So their life was a little bit, they had that front edge of watching and keeping those file folders, but their life became a little bit happier when they reached a coming of age point of view. So they're looking more for security. They have a belief, again, still in the traditional top-down and staying with the organization. Although the suggestion is here, this is from the Journal of Business Psychology, that they're not as entrepreneurial, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with as a whole, but that is the definition that they're doing. If we take a look at the boomers, of course, probably a large percentage of us in the room fit into that category. They are the most heralded group of all. They're supposed to be non-conformists, they're supposed to be spiritual, they're supposed to be the ones taking on the world, and they're also the ones who are probably going to be changing the definitions of what it is to work beyond the age of 65. So it's important to keep that in mind. They, though, still think, for the most part, of staying with an organization and climbing the ladder. That's part of their work definition. If you take a look at Gen Xers, though, that's a very, these are the latchkey kids. These are the kids who were experiencing a rise in divorce rate when they were children, and they were also experiencing two-family incomes, or two-income families, I should say. So they are a bit of a cynic as a group. As a group, they are looking more about life balance than their elders who are working 120-hour weeks. They are more concerned as a group with building their portfolio. They see this job as just another job in the step. They're probably doing work for 5 or 6 companies, and unless you give them something to build their resume, they're moving on. That's the theory of the group. And then the millennials. These are the save the world people. These are the people who got a star and a trophy no matter what. These are the people who mom drives to the interview and doesn't know why she can't come in. They're optimists, they're team players, but they don't want to know about having to work 120 hours a week, unless it's fun. So, you know, they don't understand that work doesn't have to be fun, sort of thing. But if we look at these groups, part of what we also notice is that they're very large. The difference between the boomer generation, between someone who is at the front end and is looking at retirement and someone who is mid-career in their mid-40s or late 40s, could all still be in the baby boomer generation. So a lot of academics have started busting up these generations into early, middle, and late and doing some of the research based upon that. Where did we sit within these generations? And even intra-generation, are there big changes in perceptions? So if we look at the things that the generational cohorts, their mindsets are affected by, okay? So we're saying, what are the issues that the generation affects? Well, we've got personal goals. Now, when you look at these things are all socially affected. The people around you affect how you feel about these things. And the definitions of what you've seen and experienced will change these things. So, what are your personal goals? What you care about and what is valuable is often defined by your generation. Your attitudes towards work, your attitudes towards political situations, your attitudes towards your overall environment, that is driven often very much by your generation. If you take a look at your job satisfaction, or your job security, or how often you think about changing jobs, again, driven by your generation. Now, even how you learn sometimes is somewhat affected by generation. And we talk here as learners, we probably talk about pedagogy, you know, how actually pedagogy is how children learn. Andragogy is how adults learn. We start talking about andragogy, how adults learn. That's going to change over the course of your life. And it's going to change with age. So you have to understand that. We'll get later on when we get to the biology of things, how you actually learn changes over the course of your life. And you're going to worry about that. But let's just take a look specifically at job satisfaction. Again, this is a study done by the Journal of Business Psychology. And what we notice here is that the 0 is the grand mean. So if we took a look at the average of how people felt about a subject, this is using like Likert scales where we're going on a 1 to 7, you know, how do people feel about this particular thing, whether they believe or disbelieve or like or dislike. So the grand mean is 0. Okay? But each generation is going to fall above or below that line as a sub-cohort in here. So in job satisfaction, the GIs tend to be very satisfied. If I was in my late 80s, I'd be very satisfied too, just to be here to answer the questions. But as we go down here and we start getting into the silent generation and the boomers, as we get to the late boomers and early Gen Xers, they are the least satisfied of your population. And as you go forward up, you notice that if you're going into the late millennials, of course these guys are 12, so they're very happy with whatever job they have. Recognition, how you recognize someone, what recognition you give them is going to change. While they appreciate that recognition is going to change. Again, we've got this U-shaped curve from the grand mean, where the GIs tend to be happier, the millennials tend to be happier, and the boomers and the Gen Xers are miserable. Advancement. This is the only place the GIs aren't really concerned about. If you're in your late 80s, you're not going anywhere. And the millennials, of course, have this bright future in front of them. And the last but not least is job security. Okay. Now, again, the GIs feel very secure, and the millennials feel more secure than the rest of us. I would caution you, though, when we're looking at this data, if you take a look at Duncan Watts, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, or about a year ago, I guess, called Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. Watts says, look, once if I give you the data, you'll put a narrative to it. You'll put a narrative as to why this exists. If you're familiar with Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, a very best-selling business book a couple of years ago, Taleb talks about the narrative fallacy. We like to put stories to this stuff. And in fact, Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate, wrote a book recently where he suggested that what you see is all there is on a lot of this stuff. You take a look at this data, you try to be as clinical as possible with it, because there may be more to the data than what we're actually seeing, but it is interesting to look at this and try to frame what's going on in the organization. I guess what I'm cautioning is don't jump too far ahead. Don't jump too far ahead with all people in their mid-careers are miserable. It may or may not be the case. However, when we look at the data, what we find is it's statistically significant. So what that means for a researcher is that it's more than just random, that this is more than just a random pattern. We'll notice that it's also consistent in its outcome. And if we look at the consistency in outcome, that means that if we repeat this a number of times, that we're going to get similar, if not exactly the same data. And it's predictable in large numbers, which is another very important factor here. Depending upon the size of your organization, this data may not be as predictable. How many of us know the guy who is 80-year-old and goes snowboarding every weekend? You know, or the woman who is 80 years old and spends her whole time on her iPad, you know, probably FaceTiming with her grandkids. I mean, there are these flyers, and you know, not everyone in the silent generation is not an entrepreneur. You know, in fact, I'm sure there's a couple of people that we could put names to who are great entrepreneurs who are in that silent generation period. So don't assume that your population fits these profiles. And the profiles, another important thing here is that beyond just the age and these common experiences, there's lots of other things that define how you process something. Carl Mannheim, who is one of the founders of sociology in this country, discussed that the things that affect our decision process are more than just our generational age. That it takes things like class, like socioeconomic class. It takes things like location. Now, location being very important, even within the country. I used to work for an organization years ago that had an office in Fairfield County, you know, southwestern Connecticut, and a relatively affluent area. And they had another group down in Greenville, South Carolina. The differences between those two offices were dramatic. The pace at which they worked was dramatic. Where you came from the Northeast down to the Mid-South, you know. So this is even more important as you begin to change and become global. As you start bringing your organization into places like China or Latin America, these locational situations become critical. Those local cultural situations become critical in how you process. So just because you're a baby boomer, but you were brought up in Guangzhou, China, means that you probably have a very different perspective than your local baby boomers here in the Northeast. Your education, your profession, the industry, how you identify yourself as an individual, these are all things that are going to affect how you perceive things. Down to biology. So I work one day a week in Lower Manhattan. I teach at a school one day a week in Lower Manhattan, right down the street from Zuccotti Park. So I've noticed a few differences in how people perceive this common event. If you were on Wall Street and you were making the money that they're making on Wall Street, if you still have a job, on Wall Street, you might have a very different perception than if you were, say, living and working in a union job in the outer boroughs of Manhattan. Your perception of this is as much driven by your social class as it is by your generation. You could say that, that people who were here during the Vietnam era who could see that may relate better to the people on the occupied Wall Street about their social justice positioning and all that. And that's possible, but I think just as likely, where they sit socioeconomically is going to have a bigger effect on how we process this event. And if you take a look at the millennials, this Vietnam event might as well be the Civil War, because they have no recollection of this. It's just something they've read about in history class. So common events and perceptions are important, and our assumptions as to how people are going to perceive those are going to be very different. Here's another one, which I think is fun. Start talking about technology across the generations. And I have a colleague who likes to quote that if something was around, I think Doug Adams originally said this, but my colleague likes to say this, that if something was around when you were born, it's natural. It's natural, and it's just the way things are. If something happened when you were coming of age, so the age of, say, 15 to 25, then it's new and it's exciting and you can't wait to be part of it. If something happened after you were 35 as part of the milieu, it is completely unnatural and should be banned. So when we look at technology, I'm sure we have plenty of people in our organizations who perceive the use of technology in training or the use of technology within the organization as something that should be banned. They grew up maybe where the HP calculator was the dominant technology, or maybe they were the Pac-Man generation. I think if you started somewhere in the Pac-Man generation, you have a prayer. If you were prior to the Pac-Man generation, this is a real struggle for you each step of the way. But when we get down here to the millennials, these are what are commonly known as the digital natives. These are people who, websites to them are no big deal. These are people who would rather text. By the way, how many of you have children who are of the age where if you call them, they don't pick up the phone, but if you text them, they respond in about 30 seconds? Right? They interact with technology very different than you and I do. And they see phone calls. I relate this to my students when I'm teaching, is that my grandparents would think nothing of going out for a Sunday drive, driving up to a friend's house, knocking on the front door to see if they're home for a visit. Right? None of us would do that without calling first. We would call first to make sure that it was okay and it wasn't an intrusion. Your kids see a phone call as a major intrusion. They would much rather that you text them and they can respond in their own time. One last thing on this, though. I have a graduate assistant in one of the universities I teach at who works for me, and she's from Columbia. And her definition of technology was much different than my other students' definition of technology. She came from a wealthy family in Columbia, but she didn't grow up with the internet being part of her life. There is a digital divide, even within the younger generation. And depending upon the real cohort, and I'll get more to this definition later, the real cohort that you're working with, where these people are coming from, even within this country, if you look at people in the lower middle class, they don't have 6 computers in the house with 5 people. They don't have broadband necessarily. 25% of this country still does not have broadband. So they use the computers when and where they can, or they may still be on dial-up. So there is a digital divide, even intra-millennial, and how they perceive this, and most of it is driven by socioeconomic class. Okay. If you're still carrying one of these, you're part of the problem. In 2010, in the US, we crossed a point where more than half of the population of new phones were either iPhones or Androids. And these phones change your perspective on what's available and what can be done from a technology point of view. 2 of the 5 universities that I teach at currently have iPhone apps or Android apps to actually do some of your coursework or to check in on your classes. A lot of organizations that I know have moved to having some sort of support learning management system driven by a mobile platform. This is becoming critical. And how people within your organization relate to technology is partially driven by their age and their common experiences, but is also partially driven by the culture within the organization and how you get them to interact and engage with technologies. So you have to begin to get them to understand the significance of the technology and the significance of the problems surrounding technology, and change their perception as to the need. This is this side personal note on this. My wife didn't have an iPhone or an Android phone, and she never understood why for years I'm spending $30 a month to use this silly device, until she got one last week. I have not been able to pry it out of her hand with a crowbar. Angry Birds, nothing like that music plays in my house 20 hours a day right now. So often once you get this technology into their hands and they can see it, I think a couple of the other speakers have talked about the change of paradigm. Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962, pointed out that we very often will stay with a paradigm that is not working because it's what we know and what we're comfortable with. And we won't shift to a new paradigm until we are forced to, and until it's convenient. It's got to be easy to move to. So this is scary stuff for a lot of your employees. And so getting them to move on is going to be difficult. But part of it is setting the perception and the value as to what this really has, you know, what's the value that's here and what can we do with it. Okay. One thing I would also like to suggest is that some of this is stage of life driven. It's not only that you were born in name the year, but it may also be where you are in the stage of life. If I was to survey you at 20 on your perception of things, and I was to survey you again when you are 40, and I survey you again when you're 60, I will guarantee you your perception of critical things will have changed. Now, this is hard to do because this is a longitudinal study that's going to continue from when we go, when we die, and then there, of course, are factors that the environment is no longer consistent from one decade to another. Technology changes, environment changes, politics changes, economies change. So, you know, you've got to factor that in. And so it's not a very easy study to do. But I think anecdotally we all know, if we look at ourselves, the way we felt at 20, the way we felt at 30, the way we felt at 40, 50, 60, whatever our age is, we know that it's changed over time. So when you look at this, it's not only about their age or the fact that they're a boomer or a Gen Xer. It has also to do with where are they in their career and what does this, what is it, what you're proposing mean to them in their career? How does it threaten what they've built and where they're going? And last part here, I don't know if everyone knows this, is a sort of more technical academic business term, is balance. Balance is what do I care about? So we need to worry about the socializing agencies and experiences, their expectations, and the events that they're running into. But balance is the other thing here, and balance changes over time. Balance is what I care about. You know, I may care about money, I may care about time off, I may care about quality of life. There's lots of things that I care about, And the balance changes over the course of my tenure in your organization. So think about balance. What do these groups care about? And can I put a group together with different balances, different cares and concerns? Okay, biology. Did you ever wonder, do you ever find yourself saying to your teenage kid, what in the world were you thinking? Because they weren't. And the reason why they weren't is that the prefrontal lobe, the part of the brain that actually does process logical decision making, does not fully develop until you are 25. And then it takes you 5 years to figure out how to use it. So they don't know. And your younger employees don't know. They do not have the same physical equipment that you do. The second thing, or two or three other things here that we should probably talk about. One is neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, and Hebbian's theory. Okay, so neuroplasticity says that your brain can be remapped over time. So if I lose an eye, the part of my brain that is processing vision will split up and go to other adjacent areas to do processing. So I will actually process things different. Neurogenesis is really important because we were probably taught as kids that your brain stops growing once you hit adulthood. Not true. Over the last 10 years, we've learned a tremendous amount about brain theory and about brain biology. And one of the things that we've learned is that your brain actually changes over the course of your life. And that as long as you use it, you won't lose it. But it comes down to that, either use it or lose it. And before you run out and say, I've got to start doing Sudoku this afternoon so that I don't lose it, it is specific to what you learn and what you use on a day-to-day basis. So if you are doing Sudoku, it's not going to help you keep your math skills. Okay? If you're doing math, it's not going to help you necessarily with all your critical reasoning, strategic views. But if we take groups and just CAT scan them, we can see what this means to them over their lifetime. And there's a couple of very famous studies. Probably the most famous one is the London taxi drivers. Now, and I may be going out on a limb here, but I promise you I'll bring this back. The London taxi drivers have this thing called the knowledge. If you've ever been to London, they have, if you pick up a cab, that cab driver, if you say, I want to go to and name a street address, he's got to know the most efficient route to get to that street address. And this is not like New York, you know, where everything's in a grid. London streets are a spaghetti of streets that run in and out of each other. So it takes them 2 years to actually learn enough, 2 years of consistent study to learn enough to be able to get pass the licensing exam to be a London taxi driver. So what they did is they CAT scanned these guys before and after they started studying the knowledge. And what they found was that the base of the brain that processes navigation actually dramatically increased in size for these guys over the course of that 2 years of study. So as you use your brain, you force blood through the brain and you actually force the brain to grow, almost like a muscle, but in very specific areas. How you think changes the way you think and your ability to think. Another important part of this is Hebbian's theory, which says those neurons in your brain that fire together wire together. So what that means is that over time, if you consistently do the same pattern, you begin to build sort of hardcore, sort of like muscle memory things, where it becomes instinctual to do certain things. So your older employees who have been doing the same thing year after year after year after year in exactly the same way have built up a very different brain than your younger employees who haven't done it that way. And yes, now this is almost like a river. If you think about water flowing over flat ground, you know, the Hebbian's theory bit, is as you pour that water over that flat ground, you start to see it developing into streams, and those streams start digging deeper into the drain, and they start becoming wider and deeper, and it's harder for the water to go in a different direction. This is almost the way that you think. you begin to develop these paradigms in your mind through heavy theory, and you start thinking the same way over and over and over again, and you get deeper and deeper and deeper ingrained. And now to change how I'm going to do something becomes harder over time. So what is your real cohort? What do you really do? How do you really react to those things around you? How are we doing on time, Richard? Okay. Our birth cohort is maybe when we were born, but that doesn't necessarily drive how we think. You know, our lived cohort, how we live our lives, may actually be more of an indication. And how we interact with people emotionally, and how we interact with technology. These are all, we can also define ourselves by these cohorts. We can test for this, okay? You can begin to test and begin to realize, what are the real cohorts in my population? They may not be baby boomers and Gen Xers and Gen Ys. They may be people who are digital natives and people who are, let's say, reticent to technology. They could be people who are emotionally connected or learn in a specific learning style, or they may be someone who needs to sit down and go through things themselves. You can begin to test and put together cohorts within your organization. And this is important because what you want to do is understand what you're dealing with. How is my group actually processing this stuff? Okay. So part of this is understanding how to put together the communications and the message. If I take a look at two cohorts that we were commonly defined, let's just use for definition's sake, millennials and early baby boomers. They both use email, right? Except that if I send an email to a millennial and I expect some sort of follow-up on that email, that person is going to either email or text me back. If I send an email to a early baby boomer, they'll read the email, but they're not really digital natives. They don't really feel comfortable in that environment, so they're probably going to call me up or come into my office for the follow-up. So how we process our messages are going to be different. We have to think about that when planning the communication technology that we're going to use and how we actually implement those technologies from a message point of view. So we need to identify the goals of this message, not only how they process it, and then we need to begin to track this stuff. Now, when I say track this stuff, I'm thinking of it kind of more, almost like in a marketing sense. Those that may have a marketing background. Key management behaviors. Okay. I wasn't necessarily going here right away, but let's talk about tracking this, and then we'll go to key management behaviors. I would look at saying that you must keep ADA in mind. Get their attention, gain their interest, get their desire, and get an action. Okay? So attention, interest, desire, and action. What is their attention? What's going to get their attention? What's going to keep their interest? What's going to create their desire to learn in this case? And what kind of action can you expect to get from them from this message? And then you can track your intent versus what you actually had happen. When I look at key management behaviors, I would say the first thing I want to do is listen. The first thing I want to do is try to understand, what do my cohorts value? What is it that's most important to them? Because that will drive everything else. I also have to communicate to them what are my values and what is it that the organization wants from them. I gotta let them know where we're going, what's the vision, and I gotta let them know what my expectations are for their performance. So those are sort of the critical management things when coming into this. Understand your cohorts, understand their values, let them know your values, and then understand what the expectations are on both sides. And then where do we go from here? Well, I would say define the cohort, define the values, define your goals, track your results. Define the cohort, define your values, define your goals, track the results. Those are the big three. So, with that, okay. Thoughts, questions? Sure.
You mentioned the digital divide that is not only generational but also cultural and economic. One of the things that we saw in other parts of the world, particularly, for example, with the plain old phone system, that the adoption of mobile technology just leapfrogged because they couldn't wait for deployment of regular wired line or even broadband, and they just went straight to mobile. There's some of that starting to surface now as we look at some of the underserved communities in the United States, where you look at, for example, the Twitter activity. If I'm sitting in Worcester and I'm just looking at all the tweets coming in from Worcester, probably 25% of them are in Spanish.
Yeah.
So that there's an influx of activity that may not be using a desktop system, may not be using an iPad, but may instead just be using a regular smartphone with a pay-as-you-go plan, but the adoption is all the same. So I get the question is then, how do we make sure that we're looking in the right places for some of these additional adaptations that might not fit the way we might expect to find them?
I think part of it goes back to the listening thing I was talking about. You almost have to survey your groups to understand some of this stuff. It may not be a formal survey. It could be that you just get together and do focus groups within the organization if you're that kind of an organization. But to your point, even your millennials will not have hardline home phones. Roughly about 25 or 30% of the current U.S. population does not have a landline phone. So, and most of that are the young, or in Europe, like you said, those who may be immigrants or something like that coming into the country. So it is not common for them, in fact, to have a hardline phone. That's just the way they work. So that even changes the organization and how they interact with that. And the definition of time. You know, you will find there are employees, particularly in the Gen X and and boomers, who will sit there and say, I don't answer my cell phone after a certain time of day. They're probably not senior managers, but they will do that. That's not the way your millennials work. Your millennials will answer their phone 24 hours a day. That's just their lifeline to reality. But you have to be careful in that they process that as you stepping into their living room. They're going to process that differently than maybe one of your other employees. Any other questions? Sure.
Actually, it's more of a validation than a question.
Yep.
I'm from London.
Right.
So I can validate your and in fact, it's a little, just to elaborate a little bit,
yeah.
Very interesting psychological process. It's a very interesting example of state-dependent learning. These guys aren't just pouring over A to Z of London. If you're ever in London and you see somebody driving around on a motor scooter with a big A to Z propped up on the windshield, he's doing the knowledge.
Right.
He's driving around the streets of London, actually learning the shortest route between point A and point B. I personally know how the London habits. They're really smart cars.
They have to be to get that down. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. So all the way in the back.
Does this information have any known impact on the effectiveness of online trading medium?
I think what you have to do now, I've been doing online teaching for about 10 years. And you have to, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is that some of it is familiarity. And to assume that millennials have familiarity with online learning and they should be able to just jump in and take off with it is a fallacy. These kids they will figure out a way, but they're going to perceive the tool differently than you do. So they're going to go down this path which is not quite exactly where you want them to go. And there's going to be some misunderstanding. And the tools themselves are changing. I recently had a Saturday class that was on campus, on ground, that runs from 11 to 5 with a bunch of MBAs. So it's one of these every other weekend things. And it was supposed to be that weekend of the snowstorm. So I thought it would probably not a good idea that my students live an hour from campus, that they actually drive to campus. So we actually did a video chat session. Now, the technology I was using at the time was Wimba, but if any of you are familiar with Google Plus and the Hangouts in Google Plus, you can get 20 people in a virtual room that shares a desktop for free. So that is a little easier because there's a higher fidelity in the conversation because they see me, they understand what I mean. I can ask them questions. I can watch their faces to see that their eyebrows just went up. That they don't get what I just said or they start going off in a wrong direction. When you're doing the more traditional online learning, where you're using something like Blackboard or Moodle or Sakai or one of those sort of platforms, you're going to notice that you're leaving a lot of that perception up to the person in the room, and they are going to perceive it very differently than you probably intend them to, even if they're young, even if they're digital natives. All right, well, look, thanks a lot, I appreciate it.
Our final speaker this morning is Dr. Minaya. Guido has held a wide array of challenging learning and development positions for more than 25 years. He is an expert in global, national, regional, and local organizations. He is an accomplished thought leader and is taught up to the master's level. Again, I'm fortunate to say I know Guido well, and I count him as one of my friends, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Guido Minaya.
I'm going to run onto the stage. I was wanting to run onto the stage because it's a little bit of a strong stage. First off, I think this event is wonderful, right? For those of us that are learning and developing people, those of us that have businesses and training is important. To have this type of a session in our local community, in the backyard here, incredible, right? Usually we have to go to an ASPD large conference or a CLO symposium, and I think it showcases the evolution of our industry, the importance of our roles. And we're talking about generational issues, we're talking about how to sell training, we're talking about variable models, we're talking about training a global workforce. 5, 10 years ago, weren't discussion points, right? So, I mean, I love this field. I absolutely love this. I want to definitely tip my hat off to Vic, Vic Jr., Maria, for having the vision to pioneer this effort. And I would hope that others learn from them and we see these types of initiatives in other, we're from the San Francisco area, we would love to see this in the San Francisco area, right? And again, when my wife and I, Susan, drove into the area, she said, is it Worcester or is it Worcester? We concluded it was Worcester, right? And I want to tip my hat off to Worcester Business Journal. I do a lot of chamber events in California throughout the state, and for us to have had a mixer of this number of businesses, interested parties to stay, 4 hours. I mean, you might have half the crowd, and you might be able to get them for half an hour, right? So, again, a great evolution of what interests us as the business world changes in these tough economies. Who's here? Who's at the table? Folks that are involved and interested in growing businesses, training their workforces to change the economy situation. All right, well, with that, I want to thank Richard, scholar and gentlemen. Now, training a global workforce, it might seem daunting, right? So we've got a number of universities here. We've got a number of businesses here that have some sizable challenges. Let's just take a quick check. Who here is facing a global issue either because of a customer that they have outside of the U.S., or because of students they've got coming into their university, or because they've got a new part of their business that's outside of the U.S.? So let's see how many.
Okay, so a few hands, right? A few hands. And who here might have some family members that have married into have family members that are from a different country? Okay, great. Are there any language issues at Barry? I know Barry's trying to learn, Barry from the training associate. He's learning Spanish now because one of his family members married a Cuban person, and he wants to learn. I was teaching him a little bit of Spanish here, right? So again, the global issues are facing us as we expand business. They're facing us as businesses, let's say from Europe, from China, from Latin America, are coming into the U.S. They're facing us in a big way. So as we finish the summit, I want to give you some insights into training a global workforce. And this is taken from a master's degree program, which is a 12-week program. I'll teach you the 35-minute version, right? So you're at the 35-minute university with Dr. Guido Minaya. We're going to talk about the basics of culture. We're going to talk about language. We're going to talk about a real life learning and development example. But if you have an example that you would also like us to use as a case study, happy to do that. And we'll close with a framework that'll help you put this together when you get back to us. All right. Now, my sessions, and I wish I could walk around the stage. My sessions are a little bit more interactive, so I want to start with a reintroduction, right? And sometimes you go to a chamber mixer, you might say, I'm a corporate attorney and I practice corporate law, but that's such a narrow way to describe yourself, right? So I'll reintroduce myself. I am a husband, a father, my lovely wife over here, Susan. I'm a son. I enjoy Napa Valley. We live in the Napa Valley area. Love seafood. Community leader, scholar. I was born in Bolivia, became an American citizen, and I support a lot of educational interests. I love technology, and I'm a runner, right? So a little bit of who I am. What do I do? I own a business. I serve as a chief learning officer. I consult. I serve my community, and I run 25 miles a week, right? So again, each of those aspects of my life, right, are parts of the lenses that I interpret life, my business life and my family life and life in general. So the interactive part, let's take a minute each to introduce yourself to at least one person at your table based on who you are and what you do. Okay, so work amongst yourselves. You got a minute.
You have to go first. I came in late, so you have to go first.
You are a clever guy.
I know.
Enjoys reading. I'm very interested in social issues. I wouldn't say sociology, but I'm writing about sociology and politics. I can work as a vehicle to achieve social ends that are quite different than most
Okay, 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
It's not the focus of my life.
Work?
Yeah.
Awful as this may sound to
Thank
you.
you. I was going to say, because my education is with vice presidency. It's not the most. I'm very focused.
And so that was to break off the group, have a little bit of a discussion and reconvene. In your virtual classroom technologies now, virtual classroom technologies, you can do that, right? You can say, okay, well, here's a brief discussion point, now break out into groups, and then we reconvene. So globally, I know technology is an issue, but we're not going to focus too much on technology during this session. What is the goal of training a global workforce, right? It's so that there's an even playing field, right? So let's take the example of a 1 hour e-learning course, web course, on something that Vic Melfa Jr. is very familiar with, financial investments. So it's Introduction to Financial Investments in English, but we're going to deliver it in China, right? 1 hour course. So I was in China about, I worked in China about 7, 8 years ago, and in Shanghai they spoke a little bit of China, a little bit of English, right? Beijing, very little English. I was there just a few months ago, and the English that's spoken there now, you go to a shopping mall, and they'll leave an announcement, okay, we've got this promotion, that promotion, in English first, and then in Mandarin. So big shift, right? Big shift. And equally, we were surprised in our local neighborhood, there's another shopping area, like one of those outlet centers, and they led with an English announcement about promotions. And in our little area, they followed it in the US, north of San Francisco, they followed it with a Mandarin announcement. So again, we're seeing how the worlds are converging, right? So that 1 hour course that's developed in English in other languages, in other countries, might take that student 3 hours to complete, right? So here we are, L&D department based in Boston. We've got this financial investment curriculum. Why don't we have the students go through a 20-hour pre-course via the web, and then we'll do blended learning. We'll bring in a traditional classroom instructor, and we'll do a great job. That 20 hours might take someone in Europe, in Asia, or Latin America 60 hours to do, right? So what are they going to do? I'm not going to touch this. I'm going to wait until the instructor comes, and I'm going to catch up, and I'm going to ask the instructor what was on those 20 hours of that course, right? So we've got to solve for why it's taking them longer, and we're going to go through some solution steps. All right, so part of the interaction, and I'll pick someone at random. Jason, when you look at this, what do you see? Early bird gets the worm. Okay, sound about right. Early bird gets the worm, right? Now, for us in the U.S., does this have a positive connotation? Yeah, a positive connotation. What does this mean to us? Like why does this have a positive connotation?
Hard worker.
Hard worker, right?
Head start.
Head start. Reap the rewards. Get there early, right? You're the one that maybe will get there first and move forward because again you're ahead of the game, working harder. So for us, very positive connotation. As we look towards Asia, the first bird gets shot. First bird gets shot. There's not even a gun in the picture yet. Either having a cigarette or brushing his teeth, and then you got a little worm, but there's no gun there. They view this as first bird gets shot. All right, so that's like first bird gets shot. What do you think that means to them? First bird gets shot. Applying it to our business world, what does that mean to them?
Don't take a risk.
Don't take risks. Right. Don't be the first one that's vocal. So for us, we might have applied this graphic in a sales course. We would say, perfect. This maybe a little bit more of a refined view, but this absolutely meets what we're trying to say. That won't work well if you're presenting that type of a sales course right in parts of Asia. So let's take a real life L&D example. You're asked to support the launch of a new technology product in Asia. It's a technology product in Asia, and your role is to lead course development and delivery of a technical course specifically in China, right? Because when you're going to do global training, you do want to break it out into key geographies rather than taking a solution for the whole world. What are some key geographies? So now we're in Asia, in China. So your role is to develop that course in support of that product. What are your considerations, right? So let's take, is it a sales course? Is it a product sales course? Sales is contextual, right? Here, it may be a sales course in the US. We teach our salespeople, all right, build rapport, take some time, build rapport, move into your open-ended questions, try to find the need that the customer might have around your product, begin developing and formulating some solutions, maybe a test close, a feasibility close, before you get into the final close, right? And that might take you 1, 2, 3, or 4 meetings, depending on the product, depending on the complexity, right? Sounds good. In Asia, in parts of Europe, and parts of Latin America, building a trusting relationship first, before you're even really allowed to ask any probing questions, is paramount, right? So we go in with our sales course, wouldn't work. And you've got to contextualize, right? So sales course and soft skills, high context, technical and processes, low context. You open the box, you press the button, you fill in this data field, much more process-oriented, lower context, easier to train on that globally, easier to translate, right? So that's the first decision you have to make, is it low context or high context? So culture, culture is like an iceberg. There's what you can see, your five senses, your behaviors, versus what you can't see, what's under that waterline, right? So as an example, I was born in Bolivia, grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my first job was with AT&T working in Miami. And I was working the domestic market in Miami, but again, there's Spanglish, there's a lot of Latin American influence. So after a few years, I was hired to be the first international instructor teaching sales and sales management courses throughout Latin America. And my very first course that I'm delivering in sales, product sales, is in Argentina. And Buenos Aires is sort of like Manhattan, right? So if you're going to teach in Buenos Aires, they're going to grow you, right? And I thought, okay, I've got Spanish from Bolivia, I've spoken Spanish in Miami, I've got Spanglish down, and just in case I brought 3 Spanish dictionaries, I tried to translate everything, and when I got in Argentina, a combination of Italians that mixed with people from communities from Spain, communities from Argentina. They even have their own dialect, Untitled, which is a mixture of Italian and Spanish and a couple of other combinations, right? So I'm beginning to teach my product sales course, and they're saying, wait a minute, what did you say, or how did you position? And for the first day or two, we couldn't connect. We couldn't connect. Finally, we got our rhythm, but again, Spanish, English, simplified Chinese Mandarin is not universal. You've got to better understand how that language, culture, and country impact what you're trying to teach, and that's what we can see, right? So let's say in Mandarin, you might, how do you say hello in Mandarin? How do you say hello in Mandarin? Ni hao, right? Ni hao. Say hello in Mandarin. Ni hao. How do you say hello in Philadelphia?
Yo.
Yo. How you doing? Right? I took a class at Wharton, and they said that's a negotiations class. How you doing? And what's the proper response to that greeting in Philly? How you doing? So again, that's what we get in Singapore between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., or maybe 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. The greeting is, have you had your lunch? Have you had your lunch? And we got there, we thought, oh, they're inviting us to lunch. How nice. Just how's the weather? Have you had your lunch? So again, and that's what we can see. But the important things is what we can't see. And Herb's great, Herb Blanchard's great at leveraging sports and connecting with his clients through sports, right? Baseball, football. I mean, we're with a client in San Francisco, and the connection that he has with the chief learning officer over baseball, and he's taught me a lot about baseball and of course, Red Sox baseball. So he's taught me a lot there. I was working with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in the UK, and I thought, okay, great, let's talk about Manchester United, let's talk about some soccer teams. And he goes, no, I don't like that. Now, tell me about which Ferrari racing team or which Lamborghini racing team you prefer, and then we've got something to discuss. Okay, it must be a very unique situation. Another colleague from the UK saying, what do you think about Manchester United? I think it was a Premier Cup game. Oh no, I'm the Lamborghini guy. Don't talk to me about soccer, right? So again, sports is important, but then I should have done my homework in better understanding what my colleagues were better interested in, right? So again, there's what we can see and what we can't see. Culture, let's talk about the definition of culture. Here's two definitions, one that's from 1871 to one I like is a little bit more current. Culture, the second, culture is a way of life based on some system of shared meanings and is passed from generation to generation through this very system. So there's 164 different definitions of culture in various disciplines, and but again, the important part is that it's unseen and it's passed from generation to generation. So we got our L&D example, back to our real life example. What do we look at? What do we consider? We consider cultural differences, value preferences. We'll talk about each of these. Language for non-native speakers, access to technology. Some of us brought up the online learning issue, different platforms. And William does quite a bit of, William Vanderbilt does quite a bit of traveling into China. William, if you're in a primary city, let's say Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, or even some of the secondary cities, is there an access problem to technology?
No, often better than here.
Better than here, right? Isn't that interesting? Better than here. They're wired better than here. Now, you get away from those cities, into those tertiary cities like Wheeling, West Virginia, Omaha, Nebraska, China, what would you face, technology-wise?
Well, so secondary cities, okay. You get into some places, it's not even, you get access to the internet, you get access to electricity, it's consistent.
Exactly. Right. So if our grand plan is globally learning to reach this this overall audience, might not be the right solution, right? So we've got to really understand the geographies and where our course needs to be presented. India, as an example, you've got some of the best content developers there. You probably are aware of them. Great software engineers. You would think, man, it's probably all over India. Not at all. Right? Because again, the power grid is a big issue. Many medium-sized to large companies have their own backup generator to distinguish themselves from their competition. And outside of maybe a couple of cities where they still have power secondary backup generators, it's too unstable, right? So IoT, instructor-led, very big. It is a preferred solution in India. Value preferences. So we talked a little bit about technology. Now, how do you ascertain cultural differences and value preferences? Again, globally, you're in charge of some kind of a global rollout. Fortunately, there's work that's been done. Gerd Hofstede's National Cultural Dimensions has been studied over and over again. There's hundreds of studies that have been based around some of his dimensions. And he can, in his first set of studies, it was the first four. Power, distance, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Uncertainty, avoidance, we talked a little bit about this earlier, about risk. Individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, long-term versus short-term. Long-term versus short-term was the fifth one that was added based on studies in Asia and in China, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this. So, power distance. The extent to which less powerful members of institutions and organizations accept that power is distributed unequally. So what's a great example, right? Let's say that K through 16 education, in the U.S., maybe kindergarten through 5th grade, who's the authoritarian figure? The teacher, the principal, and pretty much okay. They move into 6th grade, 8th grade, middle school, not as much, right? The kids are starting to take license, a little bit more unruly. You get into high school, in public schools, you've got less authority that the teacher has, right? So it's almost like a different kind of a balance, right? Once you get into college, your teachers want you to debate a point. They want you to develop your critical thinking. So again, the balance is a little different. In other cultures, the K through 16, the teacher rules. I was teaching in Korea, and I would actually have members of the family of my students come to meet me and greet me at a restaurant, right? And revere me. And I thought, oh, goodness, I'm in a different dimension, right? But I think the point is that now that K through 16 student from those other cultures moves into the corporate world, and you're in charge of their learning and development. And you say, okay, e-learning. In e-learning, as we've heard, the instructor, professor, is more of a facilitator rather than that teacher authoritarian figure, right? Now the student feels a little uncomfortable because he or she has to post, and maybe it's a post contradicting a student or the teacher or the professor. They feel uncomfortable with that, right? It's outside of their comfort zone because they've grown up with the teacher being the authority figure. So again, an example of power distance. Uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which people feel threatened by ambiguous situations and have created beliefs in institutions that try to avoid these. Let's say the insurance industry. Risk, we've developed that institution for us, and there's others in other countries. Bipolar continuum, individualism versus collectivism. People look after themselves and their immediate family only, or people belong to groups which look after them in exchange for loyalty. There was a study done for 3rd graders, right? And they were going to color a page in a coloring book. And they all had the same page, they're going to color it. And in the US, great. They all took license. They colored it in a different way. They colored outside the line, certain colors. And, you know, because again, we reward that individual approach to learning. In Japan, same exact exercise. With just a couple glances and looks, the students aligned on which crayon and which part of the page they would start with. By the end of the little exercise, all the pages were pretty much alike. And it just shows you that teaming, that collaboration, that loyalty to the group. They wouldn't think of coloring in a different color because it's a different approach. Masculinity versus femininity. Dominant values in masculine societies, success, money, and things. Femininity values are caring for others and quality of life. Long-term orientation, persistence and being thrifty. Short-term orientation, protection of one's face with respect to tradition. I was teaching in Tokyo for the first time about 10, 15 years ago, and it was a product course, product technical sales course, 5-day course, and I've got my simultaneous translation team there. The students that needed that had their little headsets, and for the first 2 hours, not a single question, not a single word from the students. I thought, oh my God, I'm doing a bad job. So all right, 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. Let's take a 15, 20-minute break, and then automatically a queue forms in front of me, right? Students in line waiting behind, and they felt much more at ease with a private question to me that I could answer, and then I would move on to the next student. So, okay, great, made headway. I've got communications established. Now the class is going to go perfectly, right? Again, the next 2 hours, not a question, not a word. Lunchtime, the queue forms, right? So I built in a lot more times for breaks, but the important thing is, from a saving face or from a tradition perspective, they didn't want to ask an inappropriate question within their peer group, or didn't want to put me in a position where I might not have been able to understand their question or be able to respond to their question. So that private approach, much more important. So from an e-learning environment, on the one hand, we might want to consider an online course that has some group activity, because they may work better in groups, but from a way where you'll put them in conflict with the instructor or the professor, pretty challenging, right? So you're going to want to solve for that. So we've talked about a few things, right? All these dimensions. How do you get there a lot faster, right? Because you got to deliver that course in 2 months, right? So if you haven't used it, in many cases you've probably seen the book, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. It's a great cultural reference, and it'll give you some points about the dimensions, right? So Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands by Terry Morrison and Wayne Conway. Cultural overviews, tips of doing business, note before you go, negotiation strategies. So if you're an instructional designer or developing a course for a specific country, great tool, great tool. I would use this if I was traveling and just to catch up on what I might need to do a little differently in the country. And this was, it still is a very good reference. It's updated maybe once or twice every couple of years. The tool that I love is Country Navigator. Country Navigator will take maybe up to the week trends on a specific country and update their records, right? Country Navigator will take those cultural dimensions that we saw, language and other issues, and allow you to see what's taking place. Country Navigator, you'll answer 25 questions or so, and it'll say, you know what, this is which culture you line up with best. And I was surprised that the culture that I lined up with was the Australian culture. I'm from Latin America, I grew up in the US, and it's telling me, well, you're a lot more Australian than you think, right? So Country Navigator will then allow you to say, all right, if that's your profile, and you're developing a course for China, here's the differences. It'll talk about that all of those dimensions, and which ones are similar, and which ones you really have to focus in on. So those would be the two tools that I would suggest if you're developing a course, or if you're going to be an expat and live in a different country for a while. All right, so we talked a little bit about the cultural issues. Let's talk about solving from a language perspective. How many of you have heard of global English? Global English, okay, a couple have heard about global English. You again, simplified Chinese, Mandarin, there's a ton of dialects. in China. Mandarin, of course, has surfaced. In Spanish, as an example, if you're talking to translation houses, they prefer using Colombian Spanish because it's a little more pure, more direct. The pronunciation is more is clear. So global English is along those lines. It's not only the best way to convey something. We'll take Australia as an example. Some of us have a good colleague, Julio Salgado, based out of Switzerland. He speaks Spanish, French, German, and English, and great sales superstar, right? So I sent him to Australia to teach in Australia, and his first comments to the students said, "You guys don't speak English right." But they didn't understand him, right? So for his first day, they solved it by, he says, well, okay, he types it on screen. Text me your question, and I'll text back my answer. Right? So it's a class like this, it's a session like this, and he's asking them to text, right? I get a call from the managing director in Australia, and he says, get this guy out of here. Send something. We're going to fire him. So it was a pretty bad situation. After the first day, they had gotten their rhythm, and after that, he was the only sales instructor that they would accept going into Australia, right? So again, global English helps you solve for some of those issues. So here's an example. Something I want to convey, 37 words. I hope so, because my instincts are telling me that there may already be some questions, seeing as we are ahead of schedule, position ahead of schedule, in a country that is notorious for their delays and lack of transparency. Okay, makes sense to us, lack of transparency, but how are you going to properly translate that or convey that? The last one, 27-word one. I hope so, because I suspect that there will be issues. Again, that's sort of like a long lead-in to the main point. We have progressed too quickly ahead of schedule in a country that is notorious for delays, and instead of lack of transparency, unclear regulation. So when you're talking about it, global English, it's simplified, it's get to the point, and be very direct with it, right? I want to talk a little bit more about avoidable errors. Wordiness, colloquialisms, idioms. So early bird gets the worm wouldn't make it into a global English class, right? Jargon, business language, poor punctuation, unfamiliar words, phrases, all of that is something that you can avoid as you're developing content. That 1 hour financial investment course, you might be able to slim down to a half an hour. Paramedic method, so this is another approach on looking at your writing style and dissecting it in a way to make it a little clearer. One that's a little easier here is multiple words making them into one. So you see the words makeup in a course, what would you think? Makeup. And we speak English, right? So what comes to mind when you see the two words together, makeup? Cosmetics. Sorry? Cosmetics. Cosmetics, right? Sorry? Do over, right? Makeup, exactly. And it could also be to construct, right? This is made up of, the makeup of this course is, right? So as you can see, there's 3 or 4 different interpretations just here in English is our first language. So you would decide, now filter out. What do you think filter out would mean in one word? Remove. Okay, great. How about looking it over? Examine, review, exactly, right? And when you look at, how about dot the T's and, yeah, dot the T's and cross your eyes. Yes, dot the I's and cross the T's. So what does that mean? Thorough, right, accuracy, right? So we go back to our real life L&D example. You're asked to support the launch of a new technology product in Asia. Your role is to lead the course development and delivery of a technical course in China. How do you construct a framework to solve for this a lot more quickly? So I would start with taking either my Kiss Power Shake Hands book or my Country Navigator app, and you want to thoroughly understand the U.S. culture. You may have a Boston view, a Red Sox view, right? But is that applicable across the U.S. so you can compare countries? So you're going to want to know the U.S. culture very well in terms of those dimensions. Because once you have that core understanding of what your culture is about, much easier to take China and compare it. So then you'll analyze China in some of those same areas, and then you create a comparative analysis and see what are some of the gaps you have to solve for. as William said, you'll have the technology implications that you're going to want to look at. And whether you follow an adding process or a type of an adding process, you'll still follow that same process. You'll see, can you leverage global English? Right? You'll locate SMEs on both shores. So there's China and the US. You want some content subject matter experts on the China side, some content subject matter experts on the US side, and try to make sure that that content is sound on both shores. You still haven't invested in the full development process yet. You want to see what would it take to solve for these key differences. So let's say you found a ton of differences for Malaysia, where you have to rewrite the entire curriculum, and it's going to be another 1,000, 2,000 hours, right? You might say, well, wait a minute. You go back to your stakeholders and say, this one doesn't seem worth it. Now, China, on the other hand, based on the market there, you might say, this one seems worth it, right? So you're going to want to see if there's an actual return on investment. And then if there is, you develop a pilot, you evaluate, and you launch the course. So this is a framework that you can use. The other book that I love is, and I definitely would write her name down, Andrea Edmondson. Andrea Edmondson, and I'll send you something as well on some of these. Andrea has another info guide via ASTD where she describes a phenomenal framework to consider, right? So although these are the best tips out of this 12-week course, why don't we take an example? I think Staples has an example, right, of what you're attempting to do, and do you want to describe that a little bit, if you're okay with that? Okay.
So I work in the private compliance and Staples through acquisition has spread across 27 countries, and we have not only geographical differences, cultural differences, but massive generational differences from our retail associates to our boomers, and so we are looking to roll out a global privacy and security awareness program in an age where high schoolers think nothing of putting their whole life out on the web, and they're telling people, no, you can't put that out there. Staples, intellectual property, this is how it needs to be handled. So it's a good challenge that Jason here
Outstanding. So again, you see a great situation, and I'm sure, although there's 27 countries, the cities within those countries, again, just like we talked about China, night and day in terms of technology, in terms of a number of issues, right? So great example of a new initiative. Some of the others that are involved in global projects, would you be comfortable in describing a little bit about your project? Okay, please. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So they could project.
All right, so I work at Genzyme in the IT department, and a couple of years ago I was assigned to be the ERP training implementation lead. So if you're not sure what that means, you're going to Oracle, which is one huge database system from the 33 disparate systems that we had across, I don't know, maybe 30 employees in 30 countries, 32 databases, about 6,000 employees was the target. And I was faced with how to develop training for all of these finance employees in all of our countries around the world, whether or not to do it in their local language or not, to actually construct the course, deliver the course with a blended solution of instructor-led training and e-learning. So what we ended up doing was developing first English courses, and we involved an international group in helping us do that. And then we went to localize in each different country, working with SMEs on both sides of the shore. And we also had our people helping us with the process adoption piece in each country, as well as the technology piece. And that was where it was a really big key, because we tapped into the local country resources to take the framework we had built, and then be able to sort of apply that in the different areas. We faced a lot of challenges, like I would have to do training, maybe today for Boston, and then later on today for California, and then later on today for Australia, and then tomorrow morning for Ireland. So I'd have to have SME meetings twice, so I'd have this half of the world come to this meeting, so I would run meetings, multiple times. We ran a train-the-trainer program, a SME connection network, to try to bring people together, so try to build networks to do that as well. And the software that we chose had a like 20 language pack. So the e-learning that we built could be user-driven to change the language interface. So you could just, as a user, go right from Spanish to English to German. Yeah.
Great, very exciting, very exciting. I think you're collaborating. I'll close with, as you're managing teams spread out across the globe, your collaboration tool is pretty important. Whether something as basic as using, GoToMeeting and making sure that you can showcase what's being presented on screen for your managers, to a number of other collaboration tools. Virtual collaboration critical in some of these projects. Well, with that, I think any other questions before we move on? All right. Well, let me close with. I met with a Department of Commerce representative who was in charge of. There's about 176 specialists in the Department of Commerce on international business, where specialists take a specific industry and they're specialists on a specific country, and they'll help you. I mean, sometimes the studies that they will do and the support that they'll give you is at no cost, or it's something like $500, right? Incredible. And she says the only thing that is the biggest challenge for them is that less than 3% of U.S. companies have any business outside the U.S. Right? So here we are in this economic situation. China's booming, India's booming, Brazil's booming, Russia's booming, and less than 3% of companies are doing business outside the U.S. So my challenge, my wish, let's go global. Let's go global together, right? Here you've got a great team already assembled, and look forward to seeing how we can help. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido, very much. Before I draw the winner, please note that the door prize is manufactured by our very own Bose Corporation, a great Massachusetts company. So we decided to keep everything local. I also wanted to give just a small, very small pitch, and that is something about TTA, that we are positioned even today to consult with you right here, right now, about any kind of situations that you may have, be they local, national, or global, that our people are identified by, generally with a red badge, meaning that they are TTA employees. Some of the issues that have been raised today are things that are really in TTA's wheelhouse, and we would look forward either meeting with you right now after the breakfast or scheduling an appointment with you to discuss not only our capabilities, but where partnership really will propel both our companies together. And with that, time for the drawing. I think you already know who the winner is. The winner is Richie Shulman. Oh my goodness. No, the winner is, of all people, Ellis Morris. Okay, it's that wrap-up time where I want to take the opportunity to thank not only our sponsors, but certainly all of you who have come. The room is available for you to mingle and meet. No one's going to be kicking you out. Please take the opportunity, again, to meet with your colleagues, both from TTA and from other corporations and companies. So thanks again to AXO, to CompTIA, to Curry Printing, Incentive Advisors, and Knowledge Advisors. We look forward to speaking to you soon and to speaking to you often. And with that, have a very wonderful rest of the morning and a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.